Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but I honestly need to tell someone who might actually believe me. Last summer changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness, and I'm still trying to make sense of it months later. My buddy Marcus and I have been into gold panning for years. Nothing serious. We're not quitting our day jobs or anything, but it's something we do a few times each summer. We've got our favorite spots in BC, and last August we decided to try our luck at Wells Grey Provincial Park, where the Clearwater and Quesnel rivers meet. The area is pretty remote, which is exactly what we wanted. Just us, the rushing water, and the chance to maybe find something shiny in our pans. We drove up early on a Saturday morning. It was one of those perfect summer days. Not too hot, clear blue sky, just right for being out on the water. We parked the truck at this little clearing about a quarter-mile from the river. The hike down wasn't bad, just a bit steep in some spots with our gear. We had our usual stuff: pans, shovels, a couple snacks, water bottles, and a small first aid kit. Marcus is always prepared like that. When we got to the confluence, it was even better than the pictures we'd seen online. The water was low enough that there were plenty of good spots to pan, with some nice gravel bars exposed. We set up at this perfect section where the currents merged, figuring that's where the heavier gold particles might settle. For about 2 hours, everything was completely normal. We found a few tiny flakes, nothing to retire on, but enough to keep us interested. The sun was warm on my back. Birds were chirping, and the steady sound of the river was exactly the kind of peace I needed after a stressful week at work. Then we heard it. At first, I thought it was just some kind of bird I wasn't familiar with. This high-pitched, almost whistling cry from across the river. It was weird, but not alarming. The sound seemed to come from the tree line on the opposite bank, maybe 75 yards away. Marcus looked up briefly, then went back to his pan. I remember saying something like, "Weird bird," and he just nodded. About 10 minutes later, we heard it again, but louder. "This time," Marcus said, "that doesn't sound like any bird I know." I agreed, but figured it might be some animal in distress, or maybe even someone's dog from a campsite we couldn't see. We both scanned the opposite shore, but didn't see anything unusual among the thick trees. We went back to panning, but I was feeling uneasy. Something about that sound just wasn't right. It was almost like a call or a warning. It had this quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. Then came the splash. A large branch hit the water maybe 15 feet from where we were working. At first, I thought it had just fallen from a tree, but there was something deliberate about it. The splash was big enough to make us both jump, and when we looked at the branch floating downstream, it was obvious it hadn't just fallen. It had been thrown with force. "What the hell was that?" Marcus asked, standing up straight and scanning the tree line again. Before I could answer, another object hit the water, this time a rock about the size of a bowling ball. It landed halfway across the river, sending up a huge splash. Now we were both on our feet, completely alert and honestly starting to freak out. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by shadows but unmistakably there, was the largest bipedal figure I've ever seen in my life. It was massive. I'm 6'2", and this thing towered over what my height would be if I was standing where it was. If I had to guess, it was at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. "Marcus," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the figure. "Look over there, 3 o'clock. I heard his sharp intake of breath as he spotted it too. "Holy shit," he whispered. "Is that a—" "I think so." I cut him off, not wanting to actually say the word. The creature stepped further out from the tree cover, and I got a better look. It was covered in dark, matted hair, not black, but a deep brown that almost looked reddish where the sun hit it. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, like a linebacker on steroids, and its arms hung down to its knees. The proportions were all wrong for a human, even an unusually large one. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. Even from across the river, I could make out a heavy brow ridge that shadowed its eyes, which seemed to be set deep in its face. The jaw was prominent and powerful looking. It wasn't wearing clothes or carrying anything. It was completely wild. I stood there frozen, my gold pan still in my hand, water dripping from it. Part of my brain was shutting down from shock, while another part was racing, cataloguing every detail, knowing no one would believe us without evidence. The creature, I still have trouble saying Sasquatch without feeling ridiculous, took another step forward and reached down. When it straightened up, it had another large rock in its hand. Then it did something that chilled me to the bone. It looked directly at us and let out another of those high-pitched cries, this one longer and louder than before. The sound echoed across the water and seemed to hang in the air. Then it hurled the rock toward us. This rock didn't make it as far as the first one, but the message was clear. We weren't welcome. This was its territory, and we were trespassing. "We need to go," Marcus said, already gathering his stuff. "Now!" I didn't need convincing. We hastily shoved our equipment into our backpacks, not caring that we were getting everything wet and muddy. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my pan twice. The whole time, I kept glancing across the river, where the creature remained at the edge of the trees, watching us. As we started to move away from the shore, it let out another cry, even more intense than the others. The sound followed us as we scrambled up the path toward the truck. I swear I could feel its eyes boring into my back the entire time. The quarter-mile hike back to our vehicle felt like 5 miles. We were both breathing hard, not just from the climb, but from pure adrenaline. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made us jump. Even though the creature was across the river and we hadn't seen it cross, there was this irrational fear that it might somehow be ahead of us, waiting. When we finally reached the truck, I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the doors. We threw our gear in the back and jumped in. Only when the doors were locked and the engine was running did I feel like I could breathe again. "Did that really just happen?" Marcus asked, his voice unsteady. I nodded, unable to find words. My hands were still shaking as I put the truck in gear and started driving away from the clearing. As we headed down the dirt road that would take us back to the main highway, we heard one last cry echoing through the trees, that same high-pitched whistling sound that had first caught our attention. It seemed to follow us for miles. When we were finally back on paved roads, heading towards civilization, we started talking, both of us speaking quickly, interrupting each other, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. "It was warning us," Marcus said at one point. "Those rocks weren't really aimed at us. If it wanted to hit us, I bet it could have." I thought about this. Yeah, it felt like it was establishing a boundary, telling us to back off. "Did you see the way it moved? So fluid, but powerful. No person could move like that. And those arms," I added. "Way too long." We spent the entire drive back analyzing every detail, as if talking about it would somehow make it more real, or perhaps less terrifying. We stopped at a diner about an hour away from the park, both of us ordering coffee, even though it was late afternoon. I remember staring at my hands wrapped around the mug, still seeing phantom images of that creature whenever I closed my eyes. "No one's going to believe us," Marcus said after a while. He was right. Without photos or video, our story would sound like just another tall tale from guys who spent too much time in the woods. But we knew what we saw. It was real. It was intelligent. And it had deliberately driven us away from its territory. By the time we got home that evening, we'd already started making plans to go back. Next time with cameras, audio recorders, better equipment. We talked about setting up at a safer distance, using telephoto lenses, being more prepared. But here's the thing. It's been months now, and we still haven't gone back. We've made excuses. Work is busy, the weather isn't right, maybe we should wait until spring. But the truth is, I'm scared. Not just of seeing that creature again, but of not seeing it. What if we go back and there's nothing there? What if we can't prove what we experienced? Or worse, what if it remembers us and is waiting? I've researched countless Sasquatch sightings since that day, and many share similarities with our experience: the rock throwing, the distinctive cries, the intimidation behavior. But reading other people's accounts doesn't make me feel any better. It just reinforces that there's something out there in those woods that science can't explain. I still pan for gold occasionally, but now I stick to more populated areas. Sometimes, when I'm by a river, I catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that massive figure watching me. Marcus says he does the same thing. We both know we witnessed something extraordinary that day. Something that most people spend their whole lives hoping to see or denying exists at all. But the wonder of that realization is overshadowed by a persistent uneasiness that I can't shake. I still have the coordinates saved on my GPS. Sometimes I look at them, thinking about that spot where the rivers meet, wondering if it's there right now, going about whatever life it leads in the remote wilderness. I wonder if it remembers us as clearly as we remember it. Maybe someday I'll work up the courage to go back to Wells Gray, properly equipped this time. But for now, I'm content to let that creature keep its privacy in the deep forests of British Columbia. Some mysteries, I've decided, might be better left unsolved, but I know what I saw. And no matter how many people don't believe me, nothing will ever convince me that what stood across that river that day was anything other than the creature people have been reporting in those mountains for hundreds of years. Story 2. I've never really told this story outside of my immediate family. It's hard to talk about for a couple reasons. First, nobody ever believes you when you say you've seen a Sasquatch, and second, the only other person who witnessed it with me isn't here anymore to back me up. This all happened back in the late 90s when my cousin Jake and I were teenagers. We were pretty much inseparable during the summers. Both our dads were brothers who grew up hunting and fishing in Mendocino County, California, and they passed that love of the outdoors down to us. By the time we were 16, our parents trusted us enough to let us go camping on our own for a weekend here and there. The first weird thing happened during the summer of '98. Jake and I had permission to camp near the Eel River, below Howard Lake. It was one of our favorite spots, remote enough to feel like a real adventure, but still accessible enough that we could get our gear in without too much trouble. We'd spent most of the day fishing, caught a few decent-sized trout, and were just messing around on this wide gravel bar in the late afternoon. We didn't have a real baseball or anything, so we were playing this stupid game we'd made up, where we'd toss small rocks up in the air and try to hit them with sticks we'd found. Jake was always better at it than me. I remember the sun was starting to get lower, casting these long shadows across the river, and we were talking about heading back to cook the fish for dinner. That's when it happened. We were maybe 15 feet apart when this fist-sized rock landed right between us with a heavy thud. At first, I thought Jake had thrown it, but he was looking at the spot where it landed with the same confused expression I probably had. "What the hell?" I said, looking around. The rock had come from the direction of the steep hillside behind us. It was covered in thick brush and trees. Jake cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled, "Hey, who's there?" We figured it had to be some other campers playing a prank on us. There were a few spots upstream where people sometimes set up, and we thought maybe some kids had followed us down to mess with us. "Not funny," I shouted. "You could have hit one of us." We stood there for a minute, staring at the hillside, but there was no movement, no sound, nothing. It was weirdly quiet. Even the birds had stopped chirping. "Probably just some jerks," Jake said, but I could tell he was uneasy. "Let's keep playing." We tried to go back to our game, but I kept glancing over my shoulder at the hillside. something felt off. Maybe 2 minutes later, another rock, bigger than the first, came crashing down between us. This one wasn't just tossed, it was thrown hard. It hit the gravel with enough force to bounce and roll several feet. I'll never forget the look Jake and I exchanged. Without saying a word, we both dropped our sticks and started walking quickly back toward our campsite. I remember feeling this crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching us. Every few steps, I'd look back, expecting to see someone coming down the hill after us, but there was never anything there. When we got back to our site, things got even weirder. Our tent was still up, but all our gear that we'd left outside was scattered. Not like an animal had been through it, more like someone had deliberately gone through our stuff. Our backpacks had been moved, our cooking gear was spread out, and this mesh food bag we'd hung from a tree branch to keep animals away was on the ground, torn open. The strangest part was that all the fruit we'd brought, apples and oranges, was gone. Not the beef jerky, not the trail mix, just the fruit. Jake thought maybe raccoons had gotten into it, but raccoons don't usually climb up trees, cut down food bags, and then only take the fruit. We didn't say much as we made a fire and cooked our fish. Every sound from the woods made us jump. We tried to laugh it off, make jokes about forest ghosts and stuff, but I don't think either of us slept much that night. We packed up early the next morning and hiked out. On the drive home, we talked about it and decided it was probably just some local kids messing with us. But deep down, I think we both knew that didn't really make sense. The next summer, 99, we went back to Mendocino County, but we picked a different spot. Neither of us admitted it, but I think we were both a little freaked out by what had happened the year before. This time we went up to Hammerhorn Lake to try for some brook trout. It's a beautiful alpine lake, really remote. You have to hike in about 6 miles from the nearest road, and the trail isn't well maintained, so not many people make the trip. We'd set up camp near the lake's outlet stream and spent the morning fishing the lake itself. By early afternoon, we decided to try working our way upstream to see if we could catch anything in the deeper pools. The stream had carved this little canyon through the forest, with thick brush on both sides in most places. We were moving really quietly, the way our dads had taught us, stepping carefully on the rocks to avoid spooking the fish. About a half-mile upstream from the lake, we came to this massive granite slab that the water had cut around. It was maybe 20 feet high, and we figured we could get a better view of the stream ahead if we climbed up on top of it. The climb wasn't too difficult. The rock face had plenty of handholds. Jake went first and I followed. When we reached the top, we were both a little out of breath, so we just stood there for a minute, taking in the view. The forest stretched out in all directions, dense and green, with the stream cutting a narrow path through it. That's when we heard it, a scream that made my blood run cold. It wasn't human, definitely not a bird or a coyote, nothing I'd ever heard before. It came from below us, maybe 50 yards downstream, in the direction we'd just come from. Jake grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, we saw movement in the brush below. Something was moving along the edge of the stream, in and out of view through the trees. At first, it was on all fours, and honestly I thought it might be a bear, even though black bears aren't usually that aggressive. Then it made these 4 massive leaps across a sandbar, covering ground in a way no bear could. As it moved, it made these strange sounds, sort of like hoof or woof noises, but deeper, more guttural. And then, in a motion that I still see in my nightmares, it stood up. Standing on 2 legs, it turned and looked directly up at us. We were maybe 25 yards away, with a clear line of sight down from our position on the granite slab. I remember feeling this wave of fear and disbelief wash over me, like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. The creature was dark brown, almost black in some places. It stood about 6.5 feet tall, with these impossibly broad shoulders that tapered down to a narrower waist. I'd guess it weighed around 250 pounds of solid muscle. What struck me most was that it didn't have fur like a bear. It had hair, like a human's, but covering its entire body. Its face is what convinced me this wasn't some guy in a suit playing a prank. It had this flat nose with nostrils that pointed downward and eyes that were deep-set and dark brown. There were no whites visible in the eyes, which gave it this intense primal look. The face was somewhere between human and ape, but not exactly like either. For what felt like forever but was probably just a few seconds, it stared right at us, not just in our direction, at us, making eye contact. There was intelligence there, awareness. I felt recognized, like it knew exactly what we were and was deciding what to do about us. Jake and I were frozen. I don't think either of us was even breathing. Then it made this huffing noise, like it was snorting air through its nose, turned away from us, and in 3 or 4 powerful strides disappeared into the thick brush. We stayed on that rock for at least an hour, too scared to move. When we finally did climb down, we moved as quickly as we could back to our campsite, packed up our essential gear, and hiked out that same day, leaving some of our stuff behind. We didn't care. We just wanted to get out of there. On the long hike back to the car, we talked about what we'd seen. There was no doubt in either of our minds. We'd encountered a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, the deliberate way it had watched us. This wasn't just some animal. We made a pact to go back someday with cameras to try and get evidence, but we never did. Life got in the way. College applications, summer jobs, girlfriends, and then, in the spring of 2000, Jake was killed in a car accident. Drunk driver hit him head-on. He was only 18. In the years since, I've gone back and forth about sharing this story. Without Jake here to confirm it, it's just my word. And I know how it sounds. Believe me, I do. If someone told me this story, I'd probably think they were full of shit or had mistaken a bear for something else. But I know what I saw. What we saw. 2 separate encounters, 1 year apart, in the same general area. The rock-throwing incident makes more sense now. I've since read that rock-throwing is a common behavior reported in Sasquatch encounters, apparently used to warn people away from their territory. I've gone back to Mendocino County many times since then, though never again to Hammerhorn Lake. Part of me wants to return there with better equipment, maybe find some evidence that would validate what Jake and I experienced. But another part of me is still afraid of what might be watching from the trees. Sometimes I wonder if it recognized us the second time, if it remembered the teenagers from the river the year before and sought us out. I'll never know. But what I do know is that there are things in the forests of Northern California that science hasn't explained yet. And sometimes, when I'm hiking alone and the woods get quiet, I still get that feeling on the back of my neck. Like something's watching me, deciding whether to throw a rock or just let me pass through its territory unharmed. I miss Jake every day, and sometimes I feel guilty that I'm the only one left who knows what we saw, like I'm somehow letting him down by not proving it to the world. But I know what we experienced was real. It changed how I see the wilderness forever. Still beautiful, still peaceful, but hiding secrets most people will never encounter. Story 3. I've never been the type to believe in the unexplainable. Bigfoot, UFOs, ghosts, all that stuff was just entertaining nonsense to me. That changed in September 1992, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it almost 30 years later. My boyfriend David and I had been dating for about 2 years. We both loved the outdoors and would go camping whenever we could get away from our jobs in San Francisco. That weekend, we decided to camp at Handy Woods along Highway 128 in Mendocino County. We'd heard about Montgomery Woods and its amazing old-growth redwoods, but had never been there before. Our campsite was pretty basic, just our tent, a fire pit, and our old Beta Subaru wagon packed with supplies. We arrived Friday evening, set up camp, and spent the night planning our hike for the next day. David was excited about photographing the massive redwoods. He'd brought his Canon camera and several rolls of film. This was way before digital cameras were common. I remember him saying, "Sam, you won't believe how huge these trees are until you stand next to one." We woke up around 5:30 the next morning. It was chilly, maybe high 40s, and a thick fog had settled over everything. I remember thinking it looked like we were camping in clouds. We made instant coffee on our little camp stove and ate some granola bars. David suggested we head out early to avoid other hikers. "It'll be more magical if we have the forest to ourselves," he said, and I agreed. We dressed in layers. I had on jeans, hiking boots, a t-shirt, flannel shirt, and my dad's old army jacket. David wore his usual hiking outfit, cargo pants with a million pockets, hiking boots and a North Face fleece. We packed some snacks, water bottles, and a small first aid kit in my backpack. The drive to Montgomery Woods took about 20 minutes from our campsite. When we pulled into the parking area around 6:45, there were no other cars. The fog was still heavy, making the massive redwoods look like they were floating. It was eerily quiet. No birds singing, no wind, just stillness. We found the trailhead easily enough and started our hike. The path was damp from the fog, making our footsteps nearly silent on the soft ground. The redwoods towered above us, disappearing into the mist. It felt like walking through a prehistoric world. About 30 minutes into our hike, I got this weird feeling on the back of my neck. You know that sensation when you think someone's watching you? It was like that, but stronger. I stopped walking and turned around. "What's wrong?" David asked. "I thought I heard something behind us," I whispered, not sure why I was whispering. "Like footsteps." We both stood absolutely still, listening. The forest was silent except for water dripping from the trees. After about a minute of hearing nothing, David shrugged. "Probably just an animal, or water dropping from the trees," he said. I nodded, but couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. We continued hiking, the trail winding through the massive redwoods. The fog was starting to lift slightly, but the forest still had this dreamlike quality. About 15 minutes later, we came to a clearing with a massive redwood that had fallen decades ago. Its root system stood taller than both of us combined, creating a wall of tangled wood and earth. "This is incredible," David said, pulling out his camera. He took several photos of the fallen giant while I sat on a nearby log to rest. That's when I heard it. Something big was moving through the underbrush about 20-30 yards away from us. Not like a deer or even a bear. This sounded massive, pushing through branches and undergrowth with force. "David," I whispered urgently, "do you hear that?" He lowered his camera and nodded slowly, his eyes wide. We both froze, staring in the direction of the sound. The movement stopped, like whatever it was had realized we were there. David, trying to act brave, though I could see his hand shaking, whistled sharply, the kind of whistle you'd use to call a dog. Immediately the movement stopped. For maybe 5 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then the movement continued, more deliberate now, like it was trying to be quieter, but couldn't because of its size. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. David shook his head, his face pale. The movement stopped again, this time about 100 feet away from us. We could hear heavy breathing, deep, rhythmic breaths that seemed to come from something with massive lungs. Then it happened. The thing, whatever it was, let out a scream that turned my blood to ice. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, not an elk. It started as a deep rumble that quickly escalated into a high-pitched howl that echoed through the trees. It was so loud my ears hurt, and it seemed to go on forever. I instinctively grabbed David's arm, digging my fingers into his flesh. When the scream finally stopped, the forest was deathly quiet for maybe 3 seconds. Then, from several hundred yards to the west, came an answering scream. Similar, but slightly different, maybe higher pitched. "Oh my God," I whispered, my voice shaking. "There's two of them." The first creature screamed again, this time louder and longer. The sound demonstrated enormous lung capacity. No human could sustain a scream like that. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt tears welling in my eyes from pure, primal fear. After the second scream, we heard movement again. The creature was moving parallel to the trail now, not coming toward us, but not moving away either. It was almost like it was pacing, sizing us up. David and I were frozen. I don't think either of us was even breathing. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what was happening. A bear? No. The screams were nothing like a bear. Mountain lion? They don't walk on two legs. Because somehow, even though I couldn't see it clearly, I knew this thing was walking upright. Then we saw it. Through a small clearing between the trees, maybe 75 feet away, we caught a glimpse of the left side of the creature. It was walking upright on two legs, covered in dark brown or reddish-brown hair. The thing that struck me most was its size. It had to be at least 7 feet tall. But it wasn't just tall. It was massive through the chest and shoulders, with arms that hung lower than a human's would. I remember seeing its wrist as it pushed aside a branch. It was as thick as David's bicep. It turned its head toward us, and for 2 or 3 seconds, it looked directly at us. Its face was hard to see clearly through the remaining fog and distance, but I could make out dark eyes set deep under a prominent brow ridge. It didn't have a muzzle like a bear. Its face was flatter, more human-like, but definitely not human. The creature held our gaze for what felt like an eternity, but was probably just a few seconds. Then it turned right and moved quickly down into a ravine, pushing through the vegetation with ease. We could track its movement by the shaking branches and the sound of breaking twigs, but within seconds it had vanished into the dense redwood forest. David and I stood there, completely still, for what must have been 5 minutes. Neither of us spoke. I was afraid that if I opened my mouth, that thing would hear me and come back. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Finally, David whispered, "Did you see that? Tell me you saw that." I nodded, unable to form words. My legs felt like jelly, and I realized I was shaking uncontrollably. "We need to get out of here," David said, his voice barely audible. "Now." We turned and started walking back toward the trailhead as quickly and quietly as possible. Every few steps, we'd stop and listen, terrified of hearing those footsteps again. The forest that had seemed so peaceful earlier now felt threatening. Every shadow might be hiding one of those creatures. Every sound might be them following us. About halfway back to the trailhead, we heard another scream. Far in the distance this time, maybe from the same creature we'd seen or maybe from the other one. David grabbed my hand, and we practically ran the rest of the way. When we finally reached the parking area, our car was still the only one there. We jumped in, and David's hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. As we drove away, neither of us spoke. What could we say? We'd just seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. Back at our campsite, we debated what to do. Should we pack up and leave? Should we tell someone? Who would believe us? "It was a Sasquatch, wasn't it?" I finally said, the word feeling strange in my mouth. I'd never believed in Bigfoot before. It was just a myth, a story to sell tabloids and bad TV shows. David nodded slowly. "I don't know what else it could have been. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a suit. It was something else." We decided to stay at our campsite that night, mainly because we were too shaken to drive the 3 hours back to San Francisco. We barely slept, jumping at every sound outside our tent. The next morning, we packed up and left as soon as it was light enough to see. On the drive home, we talked about whether to report what we'd seen. In the end, we decided not to. Who would believe us? We'd be laughed at, maybe even become local news for all the wrong reasons. So we kept it to ourselves, only telling a few close friends who, predictably, thought we were exaggerating or had seen a bear. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It was something that shouldn't exist, but does, something that lives in those ancient redwood forests, mostly unseen. It's been almost 30 years, and I've never gone back to Montgomery Woods. David and I broke up a year after the incident, not because of what happened, but for other reasons. I sometimes wonder if he still thinks about that day as much as I do. I don't talk about it much anymore. People either don't believe me or think I'm crazy. But every September, when the fog rolls in over San Francisco, where I still live, I remember. I remember the stillness of the forest, the massive trees, and that scream that seemed to come from another time. I remember the creature's eyes as it looked at us. Not aggressive, not afraid, just aware. Aware of us in the same way we were aware of it. I don't need anyone to believe me. I know what I saw. And somewhere in the redwood forests of Northern California, they're still there, watching, waiting, screaming into the fog. Story 4. I've been holding on to this story for 30 years, but I need to share it. Not for attention, or because I'm trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to put this out there, while I still remember all the details clearly. Back in 1992, I worked as an assistant caretaker for the Sierra Club Foundation at Horse Camp on Mount Shasta. If you've never been there, Horse Camp sits at about 8,000 feet elevation, right at the edge of the tree line. There's this old stone hut built in 1922, pretty basic but sturdy, where hikers and climbers can get water and shelter. My job was basically to maintain the place, help climbers with information, and make sure nobody trashed the mountain. I usually worked weekends since I had a regular job during the week. The schedule was flexible, and I'd sometimes stay overnight Thursday through Sunday. It was peaceful work, tiring, but I loved being on the mountain. This particular Thursday in late July was unusually warm. I'd hiked up from Bunny Flat Trailhead, carrying supplies around 3 p.m. It's only about 1.5 miles, but all uphill with a heavy pack. I reached Horse Camp sweaty and tired, but in a good mood. The weather was perfect, crystal clear with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes down. I knew my relief, RW, was scheduled to arrive sometime the next day. RW was this older guy who'd been doing this way longer than me. Bit of a character and loved playing pranks. He'd sneak up on you just to get a laugh. We got along great, though. I spent that afternoon checking the water source, a natural spring near the hut, sweeping out the hut and chatting with a few day hikers. By evening I was alone. Most climbers start their summit attempts around midnight or early morning, so Thursday evenings were usually quiet. I cooked some ramen on my little stove, read for a while as the sun set, and decided to turn in early around 10:30. Now I didn't sleep in the stone hut, even though I could have. I preferred my tent, just a simple north-face 2-person dome tent I'd set up about 100 feet from the hut. I liked having my own space, and honestly, that old stone hut got cold at night despite being July. I was almost asleep when I heard it, the sound of someone walking around the hut. The area around the hut has these small rocks and stones, so when someone walks there, you get this distinct crunching sound. Crunch, crunch, pause. Crunch, crunch, pause, like someone walking slowly, deliberately. My first thought was that RW had decided to come up early to surprise me. It was exactly the kind of thing he'd do, hike up in the dark and mess with me. So I called out, "RW, that you? Come on, man, I'm trying to sleep." Nothing. Just those footsteps continuing to circle the hut. I called out again, louder this time. Still nothing. I started to feel uneasy. I knew every sound on that mountain after months of working there. What the wind sounds like when it hits the trees, how small animals move through the underbrush, how snow shifts and settles. This was definitely footsteps. Heavy ones. The footsteps stopped circling the hut and started moving in my direction. Slow, deliberate steps coming toward my tent. I sat up, fully awake now, heart pounding. I reached for my flashlight but decided not to turn it on yet. I had an ice axe, a classic mountaineering tool with a pick and adze on the head that I always kept near me in the tent. I grabbed it, feeling the cold metal in my palm as the footsteps got closer. They sounded different than human steps, heavier, wider spaced. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent on the left side. I could hear breathing, deep, rhythmic breathing. I froze, barely breathing myself, ice axe clutched tightly. Then whatever it was moved again, this time right in front of my tent. My tent had a mesh door that was partially unzipped for ventilation, and as I looked through it, I saw a massive silhouette against the night sky. The moon was nearly full that night, so I could make out the shape clearly. It was huge. That's what hit me first, just the sheer size of it. I'm 6'3" and pretty big myself, but this thing towered over what my height would be standing. It was broad, too, not fat, but wide-shouldered and solid-looking. It stood there about 30 feet in front of my tent, completely still. I could just make out the outline. A large head directly on broad shoulders, no distinct neck. Long arms hanging down, and it was looking right at me. I couldn't see its face, just the black shape against the night sky, but I knew it was staring at me. I can't explain what happened next. I should have been terrified, and part of me was. But something else took over. It wasn't courage exactly, more like instinct. I'd always heard that when confronted by a predator, sometimes the best defense is to be aggressive. Without really thinking it through, I yanked the tent door open completely and jumped out, ice axe raised above my head. I remember yelling something, not words, just a shout. For a moment, probably only seconds, but it felt like forever. We just stared at each other. I could see it better now. It was at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. Its arms were longer than a human's should be, hanging down almost to its knees. I still couldn't make out its face clearly, just the shine of eyes reflecting the moonlight. Neither of us moved. I stood there, ice axe still raised, trying to look bigger than I was, though that seemed ridiculous given its size. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then, slowly, it turned away from me. Not like it was afraid, but almost like it was respecting my space. It walked toward the tree line, not running, just a slow, swinging walk. Its arms swayed slightly, and I noticed its legs were slightly bent, not fully extending with each step. The way it moved was both familiar and alien, like a human walk, but off somehow. I stood rooted to that spot until it disappeared among the trees. I have no idea how long I stayed there afterward, probably only minutes, but it felt like hours. Eventually, the cold night air snapped me back to my senses, and I realized I was standing outside my tent in just my thermal underwear, clutching an ice axe, shivering. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in my tent with my flashlight on, ice axe across my lap, listening to every sound outside. But there was nothing. Just the normal nighttime mountain noises. When dawn finally came, I cautiously emerged from my tent. The morning was clear and beautiful, like nothing had happened. I half expected to find huge footprints, but the ground around Horse Camp is mostly small rocks and shale, not great for leaving prints. I did walk to where I'd seen it disappear into the trees, and found an area where something had disturbed the steep slope. Loose dirt and small rocks looked like they'd been displaced by something struggling to climb up. RW showed up around noon, and I nearly crushed him with a hug when he arrived. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't tell anyone for years. Who would believe it? Even now, typing this out, I'm aware of how it sounds. But here's the thing that stayed with me all these years. I never felt threatened. Startled, sure. Amazed, definitely. But the creature, and I believe it was a Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you want to call it, never made any aggressive move toward me. When I think back on it now, I almost feel bad for charging out of my tent like that. It felt like it was just curious, maybe wondering who was camping on its mountain. Mount Shasta has always had stories. The local Native Americans consider it sacred, and there are countless tales of strange phenomena there. People talk about energy vortexes, hidden cities inside the mountain, and all kinds of spiritual experiences. I was never much for that stuff, but after that night, I've been a little more open-minded. I left the Sierra Club position the following year, not because of what happened, but just life moving on. I've been back to Mount Shasta many times since then, even camped at Horse Camp a few more times, but I've never seen anything like that again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it, or if it was some elaborate prank, but deep down, I know what I saw. The memory is too vivid, too detailed to be a dream or hallucination. The weight of its presence was undeniable. I've tried researching similar encounters in the area over the years. There are some hikers who heard strange calls at night, found unusual tracks, or glimpsed something large moving through distant trees. But nothing quite like my face-to-face encounter. The strangest part is that I find myself wanting to go back specifically to see it again, not to prove anything to anyone else, but just to have that moment of connection once more. Maybe without the ice axe this time. I still don't know exactly what I encountered that night on Mount Shasta, but I do know it was real, it was intelligent, and for whatever reason it chose to walk away rather than confront me. In all the years since, I felt a strange kind of privilege that it showed itself to me at all. The mountain feels different to me now. When I look at pictures of Mount Shasta or visit the area, I see not just the beautiful peak, but a home. Something's home. And I feel like a guest who stumbled into someone else's living room by accident. I've never told this story publicly before today. I guess, after all these years, I just needed to put it down somewhere. Thanks for reading, and if you're ever at Horse Camp on Mount Shasta, show some respect. You might not be as alone as you think. Story 5. I've never shared this experience with anyone outside my family. Even after 30 years, my hands still shake when I think about that day at Lake Paris. I'm not into paranormal stuff or anything like that, but what happened that summer in 1992 doesn't have any explanation I can wrap my head around. My family, my wife Susan, our 16-year-old son Jake, and our twin 10-year-old daughters Melissa and Emily had been camping in the Sierra Nevada foothills for years. It was our tradition. Every summer, we'd pack up our old Suburban and head to Lake Paris in Riverside County for a week of fishing, hiking, and disconnecting from the world. No computers, no video games, just nature and family time. That particular day started like any other. We woke up early, had breakfast at our campsite, powdered eggs and slightly burnt pancakes, camping cuisine at its finest, and headed down to our usual fishing spot around 8 a.m. It was a small, secluded cove that we'd discovered years ago. The lake curved inward there, creating a calm pocket of water surrounded by a mix of rounded boulders and tall pines. The spot was perfect because it was sheltered from the wind, and the kids could play safely along the shoreline while I taught Jake the finer points of fly fishing. The morning passed uneventfully. We caught a few small trout, nothing worth keeping, but it wasn't really about the catch anyway. Susan was reading a paperback thriller on a folding chair with that floral pattern that screamed early 90s. The twins were collecting colored rocks along the shoreline, occasionally splashing each other and giggling. Jake was getting frustrated with his casting technique, but he was persistent. We broke for lunch around noon. Peanut butter sandwiches, Doritos, and warm sodas from the cooler. The day was hot but not unbearable, probably in the high 80s with a clear blue sky, the kind of perfect summer day that makes you forget about work and bills and everything else back in the real world. I remember checking my watch after lunch. It was 1:23 p.m. when everything changed. Jake had wandered a bit further along the shore to try his luck in deeper water. He was maybe 50 yards away when he called out, "Dad, is someone camping over there?" I walked over to where he was standing, following his gaze across the small bay to the opposite shoreline. That's when I saw it. There, in the shade of a massive granite boulder, was a figure, just squatting there. At first, I thought it was just another fisherman or hiker taking a break. The boulder was huge, probably 15 feet tall and just as wide, creating a dark shadow even in the bright afternoon sun. The figure was positioned right at the edge of that shadow, squatting on its haunches. Probably just someone resting, I told Jake, but even as I said it, something felt off. The posture was strange, perfectly balanced on the balls of its feet, arms resting on its knees. The kind of squat that gets uncomfortable after a minute or two for most people, and it was completely, unnaturally still. We went back to fishing, but I found myself glancing over at the figure every few minutes. It didn't move, not once, not to swat at the mosquitoes that were surely biting in that shady spot, not to shift weight or stretch, nothing. After about an hour, Susan noticed me looking. "What's wrong?" she asked. I pointed across the water. "See that person over there? They haven't moved since Jake spotted them an hour ago." Susan squinted against the sunlight. "That's weird. Maybe they're meditating or something." But her voice had that edge to it, the one I recognized from whenever something made her uneasy. By 3 p.m. the figure still hadn't moved. Not a single inch, no adjustment, no stretching, not even a visible shift of weight. Just staring at us. I couldn't see its face clearly from that distance, maybe 150 yards across the water, but I could feel its attention focused solely on our family. "Dad, that's really creeping me out," Jake said, no longer interested in fishing. The twins had also noticed by then and had stopped playing to stare back at the figure. I tried to rationalize it. "Maybe it's some kind of statue or art installation," I suggested, not believing it myself. Lake Paris was remote, not the kind of place you'd find public art, and I knew we'd been to this exact spot many times before, and there had never been anything there. By 4:30 p.m., Susan had had enough. The sun was lower in the sky, casting longer shadows, and the temperature was dropping. Normally we'd stay until dusk, but she gathered the twins and said, "Thomas, I'm taking the girls back to camp. That, whatever it is, I don't like it watching us." I couldn't blame her. By then, it had been over 3 hours of absolute stillness from the figure. No human could maintain that position without moving for that long. It defied natural explanation. "All right," I said. "Jake and I will stay a bit longer. Maybe we'll try to get closer, see what it is." Susan shot me a look. "Be careful, and don't stay until dark." She gathered the twins, who were now openly frightened, and headed back up the trail to our campsite about a quarter-mile away. After they left, Jake and I stood side by side, staring at the figure. "Should we yell at it?" Jake suggested. It seemed reasonable. Maybe it was some weird joke or someone in distress who couldn't move. So we called out, "Hey, you over there! Are you okay?" I shouted, my voice echoing slightly across the water. No response, no movement. Jake tried next, his teenage voice cracking slightly with tension. "Hey, we can see you! What are you doing?" Nothing. The figure remained perfectly still, squatting in that same unnatural position. I felt a chill run down my spine, despite the warmth of the late afternoon. "Let's pack up," I told Jake, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll come back tomorrow in daylight with binoculars." As we gathered our gear, I kept glancing at the figure. The sun was getting lower, casting longer shadows across the lake. The boulder's shadow had grown, and now the figure was almost completely engulfed in darkness. But I could still make out its silhouette, that perfect, motionless squat. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. As the shadow had grown around it, I could no longer clearly see if the figure was wearing clothes. Earlier, I had assumed it was a person in dark clothing, but now, in the dimming light, the figure looked wrong. The proportions seemed off somehow, the arms too long, the head too small or misshapen, and there was something about the skin, if it was skin, that didn't reflect light the way it should. Jake noticed my expression. "Dad, what's wrong?" I couldn't put it into words without scaring him more. "Nothing. Let's just get back to camp before it gets any darker." We hurried then, shoving gear haphazardly into our tackle boxes and bags. I kept looking back, unable to shake the feeling that the moment we turned our backs completely, the figure would move. Fast. The sun was setting rapidly now, the way it does in the mountains, dropping the temperature quickly. As we started up the trail away from the lake, I allowed myself one final look back. The figure was gone. I stopped dead in my tracks, scanning the shoreline. "Jake," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "do you see it anywhere?" Jake looked back, his face paling. "No. Where did it go? It was just there." We stood frozen on the trail, our eyes desperately searching the growing shadows across the lake. Had it moved while we weren't looking? Was it coming around the lake toward us? Was it already somewhere on our side of the shore, watching us from the trees? "Let's go," I said, no longer hiding the urgency in my voice. "Now." We practically ran up the trail to our campsite, constantly looking back over our shoulders. The forest around us, usually so peaceful and welcoming, now seemed filled with threatening shadows and unseen watchers. Every cracking twig made us jump. We burst into the campsite, breathless and wide-eyed. Susan took one look at our faces and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she demanded, keeping her voice low so the twins, who were playing cards in the tent, wouldn't hear. "It's gone," I said simply. "It was there, not moving for over 5 hours, and then when we started to leave, it disappeared." Susan's face went pale. "We're not staying here tonight." Part of me wanted to agree, to pack everything up and drive back to civilization, but it was already getting dark, and driving those mountain roads at night was dangerous. Besides, we had no proof of any actual threat, just a strange, unsettling figure that had watched us all day. "We'll be fine," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We have the lanterns, the campfire. We'll keep watch in shifts." That night was the longest of my life. We built up the campfire higher than usual, creating a bright circle of light around our campsite. The twins sensed our unease, but didn't know why we were suddenly so jumpy. We told them we'd heard there might be a bear in the area, a lie that seemed kinder than the truth. Jake and I took the first watch, while Susan and the girls tried to sleep in the tent. We sat side by side, facing the darkness beyond the fire's light, barely speaking. Every sound from the forest made us tense. The usual night noises, owls, wind in the pines, small animals rustling, now seemed ominous. "What do you think it was, Dad?" Jake whispered after a long silence. I shook my head. "I don't know. Maybe just some weirdo trying to scare people, or someone on drugs." But neither explanation felt right. No one on drugs could maintain that perfect stillness for hours. And how had it disappeared so quickly, without us seeing it move? Around midnight, Susan came out to relieve me. Jake insisted on staying up too wired to sleep. I tried to rest in the tent with the twins, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, listening to the night sounds, wondering what was out there in the darkness. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first light filtered through the trees, Jake was up and ready to go. "I want to go back and look," he said, "in daylight, see if there are footprints or something." I hesitated. Part of me never wanted to go back to that spot again. But another part needed answers. Needed some rational explanation to quiet the theories that had been spinning in my head all night. "We'll go together," I said. Susan shook her head. "I don't think that's a good idea." "We'll be quick," I promised. "Just to look around in broad daylight. Then we come straight back and pack up." She reluctantly agreed, but insisted we take the hunting knife from the glove compartment of the Suburban. I didn't argue. Jake and I headed back down to the lake as the sun cleared the eastern mountains. The morning was beautiful, with mist rising off the water's surface and birds calling from the trees. It was hard to reconcile this peaceful scene with the creeping dread we'd felt the night before. We went straight to our fishing spot, then looked across to the boulder where the figure had been. In the clear morning light, it looked like any other boulder, just a huge chunk of granite deposited by some ancient glacier. "Let's go around," I suggested, and we followed the shoreline, skirting the edge of the lake until we reached the opposite side. The area around the boulder showed no signs of disturbance, no footprints in the soft earth, no bent grass or broken twigs, nothing to indicate that any human or anything else had been squatting there for hours the day before. Jake circled the boulder twice, searching for any clue. "Dad, there's nothing here. It's like whatever it was wasn't even real." I ran my hand along the boulder's rough surface, feeling the morning sun warming the stone. "It was real," I said quietly. "We both saw it." We searched the surrounding area for another 30 minutes, but found nothing. No campsite nearby, no discarded items, no tracks leading away. It was as if the figure had simply materialized to watch us, then vanished back into whatever realm it came from. When we returned to camp, Susan was already packing up. One look at our faces told her we hadn't found anything. We didn't talk much as we loaded the Suburban. The twins, picking up on our mood, were subdued. We left Lake Paris before noon, cutting our week-long trip down to less than 2 days. On the drive home, Susan finally asked, "What do you think it was?" I shook my head, eyes fixed on the winding mountain road. "I don't know. I've been camping and fishing my whole life and never seen anything like it." "A person couldn't stay that still for that long," Jake said from the back seat. "It's physically impossible." "Maybe it wasn't a person," Susan whispered so softly I barely heard her. We never went back to Lake Paris after that. Found other lakes, other camping spots for our family trips. The twins eventually forgot about the bear scare that cut our vacation short. Jake and Susan and I never forgot, but we rarely spoke of it, as if talking about it might somehow summon that watching figure back into our lives. I still don't know what we saw that day. In the 30 years since, I've read about skinwalkers, about Bigfoot, about all manner of strange creatures said to inhabit the wilderness. None of the descriptions quite match what we experienced. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just a weird guy playing an elaborate prank, but then I remember the unnatural stillness, the way it vanished without a trace, the complete absence of any evidence the next morning, and I know whatever watched us from the shadows of Lake Paris that day wasn't human. The most terrifying part? Sometimes, even now, when I'm out in my backyard at dusk or walking the dog near the edge of the woods behind our house, I get this crawling sensation on the back of my neck, and I just know something is watching me again with that same patient, unblinking stare. Story 6. I still don't know how to explain what happened to me last month in the San Bernardino Mountains. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or cryptids, but after that night, I'm not so sure anymore. I've been camping my whole life, and I've seen bears, mountain lions, and all sorts of wildlife. But this was something completely different. It was supposed to be a regular weekend trip. My buddies Mike and Dave had been planning it for weeks, and we were all excited to get away from the city for a couple of days. We chose Barton Flats, southwest of Big Bear Lake. It's a nice spot, not too crowded, with good hiking trails nearby. I'd been there twice before and never had any issues. We arrived Friday afternoon around 4 p.m. The weather was perfect, not too hot with a nice breeze. We set up camp quickly, with Mike and Dave pitching their tent about 15 feet away from where I parked my van. I always sleep in my van on camping trips. It's a converted 2010 Dodge that I fixed up myself. more comfortable than a tent, and I feel a bit more secure with those metal walls around me when I'm out in the wilderness. While setting up, I remember noticing something odd in the trees about 50 yards from our campsite. A pair of yellowish eyes reflecting back at me. I pointed them out to Dave, but we both just figured it was a deer watching us. They're pretty common in the area. The eyes disappeared after a few seconds, and I completely forgot about it until much later. We spent the evening grilling burgers, drinking beers, and telling stories around the campfire. You know, typical camping stuff. Nothing unusual happened during the evening. We turned in around 11 p.m., Mike and Dave heading to their tent while I climbed into my van. I set up my sleeping bag in the back, where I'd cleared out space specifically for camping trips. With the windows cracked for fresh air, I drifted off to sleep pretty quickly. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. At first I wasn't sure what had disturbed me, maybe a dream or just the unfamiliar surroundings. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy ones, walking slowly around the campsite. My first thought was bear, which got my heart racing immediately. Bears aren't uncommon in the San Bernardino Mountains, and while they usually avoid humans, they'll definitely investigate campsites looking for food. I lay perfectly still, listening. The footsteps seemed deliberate, not like an animal randomly foraging. They circled my van once, then stopped near the driver's side door. I held my breath, hoping whatever it was would just move on. That's when the van started shaking, not a gentle rocking. This was violent. The entire van was moving side to side like someone, or something, was grabbing it and forcefully shaking it. I was thrown against the wall of the van, then back the other way. My sleeping bag tangled around my legs as I tried to brace myself. The force was incredible. I'm not a small guy at 6'2" and 215 pounds, but I was being tossed around like a rag doll. My water bottle, flashlight and backpack all went flying across the inside of the van. The shaking was so intense that I thought the van might actually tip over. In that moment, I was absolutely terrified. I couldn't understand what could possibly have the strength to shake a 2-ton vehicle like that. Finally, I managed to yell out, "Hey, stop!" And just like that, it stopped. The van settled, and there was complete silence. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. Just the quiet of the forest at night. I was panting, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stayed frozen for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then I heard Mike call from the tent, "Carl, what the hell is going on over there? You okay?" His voice broke the spell of fear that had paralyzed me. I fumbled around in the dark, found my flashlight where it had fallen, and crawled toward the back window of the van. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the flashlight. "I don't know," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. Something was shaking my van, like really shaking it. "What, like a bear?" Dave's voice joined in from the tent. "No way a bear could shake it that hard," I said, pointing my flashlight through the back window and scanning the area. That's when I saw it. Just for a second, as my flashlight beam swept left, a figure moving between the trees about 20 feet away. It wasn't a bear. It was walking upright like a man, but it wasn't a man. The beam only caught it for a split second, but what I saw has burned itself into my memory. A massive figure, completely covered in dark hair from head to toe. Not clothes, actual hair, like fur, but longer and shaggier. It moved with purpose, on 2 legs, walking past the front of my van toward the denser part of the forest. I tracked it with my flashlight through the windshield as it passed, but it kept its face turned away, so I never got a clear look at its features. What I did see was broad shoulders, massively powerful arms, and that hair covering every inch of its body. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, and then it was gone, disappearing into the trees. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, unable to move, unable to process what I'd just seen. It wasn't until Mike called out again that I snapped back to reality. "Carl, what's happening?" I grabbed my keys from where I'd left them in the cup holder, unlocked the door, and cautiously stepped out of the van. I stood there scanning the forest with my flashlight, but saw nothing else moving. "Guys!" I called, my voice shaking. "You need to come out here!" Mike and Dave emerged from their tent, both looking groggy and confused. Mike had grabbed his own flashlight, and Dave was holding a small camping knife. Not that it would have done much good against whatever I'd just seen. "What the hell was all that noise?" Dave asked, looking around nervously. "Something was shaking my van," I explained, still scanning the tree line with my flashlight. "Like violently shaking it. Then I don't know what I saw. It looked like a person but covered in hair, walking on two legs. They exchanged a look that clearly said they thought I was either joking or had been dreaming. But then Mike sniffed the air and made a face. Jesus, what's that smell?" Once he mentioned it, I noticed it too. A powerful, putrid odor hanging in the air around our campsite, like a mixture of wet garbage, rotting meat, and sewage. It was concentrated near where I'd seen the figure disappear into the trees. "That's awful," Dave said, covering his nose with his shirt. "Like a dead animal or something." We all stood there in silence for a moment, listening to the forest. The normal night sounds, insects, the occasional owl, had returned, but there was still a tension in the air that none of us could shake. Guys," Mike said, suddenly looking more serious. "Something was messing with our tent earlier. We thought it was you playing a prank." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Like 20 minutes ago, something was tossing little pebbles onto the tent, just little ones, but enough to wake me up. Then something brushed against the back of the tent, like pressed against it for a second." Dave nodded. "I felt it too. We called out thinking it was you, but there was no answer. We figured you were just trying to scare us and went back to sleep." A chill ran down my spine as I realized whatever had shaken my van had been checking out their tent first. I didn't want to scare them, but I needed to tell them what I'd seen. "Guys, I think it might have been a Sasquatch." I expected them to laugh, but neither did. Instead, Dave just swallowed hard and looked toward the trees. "Let's get a fire going," Mike suggested, and we all agreed that was a good idea. None of us were going back to sleep anyway. We rebuilt the campfire from earlier, and I grabbed the extra firewood from my van to make sure we'd have enough to last until dawn. As the flames grew, we sat around it, keeping our voices low as we discussed what had happened. "Could it have been a bear walking on its hind legs?" Dave suggested. I shook my head. "Bears don't walk like that for more than a few steps. This thing was moving like a human, steady, deliberate, and the way it shook my van, that would take incredible strength." "A person in a costume," Mike offered, but even he didn't sound convinced. "At 2:30 in the morning, in the middle of nowhere, and what person could shake a van like that?" We fell silent, watching the flames dance. The smell had dissipated somewhat, but I could still catch whiffs of it when the breeze blew from that direction. "I've heard stories," Dave finally said, "about Bigfoot in these mountains. I always thought they were bull, you know, just stories to scare kids or whatever, but the way you described it—" "I know what I saw," I said firmly. "I'm not claiming to know what it was for sure, but it wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a person in a costume." We stayed up for the rest of the night, feeding the fire and jumping at every sound from the forest. As the sky began to lighten, we made a unanimous decision to pack up and leave. None of us said it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing. We didn't want to spend another night there. Breaking camp took us half the time it usually does. We were packed and ready to go by 7 a.m. As I did a final sweep of our campsite to make sure we weren't leaving anything behind, I noticed something at the edge of the clearing that made my blood run cold. Footprints, huge ones, much larger than any human foot, with 5 distinct toes. They led from the forest, circled both my van and the tent, then disappeared back into the trees in the direction where I'd seen the figure go. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt, so they weren't clear impressions, but they were definitely there. I called Mike and Dave over, and we all stood staring at them. None of us took pictures. We were too freaked out and just wanted to get out of there. That's something I regret now, because I know how this story sounds without evidence. The drive back was quiet. We stopped at a diner in Big Bear for breakfast, but none of us had much appetite. We tried to talk about it, to make sense of what had happened, but kept going in circles. By the time we got back to LA, we'd settled on an unspoken agreement. We'd experienced something unexplainable, something that didn't fit into our normal understanding of the world. It's been a month now, and I still can't stop thinking about that night. I've researched Sasquatch sightings in the San Bernardino Mountains, and it turns out there have been dozens over the years. Some of them describe exactly what we experienced: the rock throwing, the powerful smell, the incredible strength. I don't know if I'll ever go camping again, at least not for a while, and definitely not at Barton Flats. Sometimes at night, I still wake up feeling like my bed is shaking, and I can't forget those few seconds when my flashlight beam caught that figure, walking like a man, but definitely not a man, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, if someone had told me this story a month ago, I'd have thought they were making it up or had drunk too much around the campfire. But I know what I saw, and whatever it was real. Story 7. I still get goosebumps thinking about that night in 2004. Sometimes I wonder if I should even write this down, because people will think I'm crazy or making it up for attention. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone else has seen what I saw. I was a student at Deltec in Delaware back then, taking night classes to get my associate's degree while working days at a warehouse. It was a Tuesday in late October, around 10:30 p.m., and I was driving home from my business management class that ran until 10. I was tired as hell after working a full shift before class, and all I wanted was to get home, grab something to eat, and crash. I always took this shortcut through the back roads to save about 15 minutes off my commute. Not many people knew about it, which was fine by me, less traffic to deal with. The route took me down Ashbury Road, this narrow 2-lane stretch that cuts through a wooded area. During the day it's nothing special, just trees and the occasional house set back from the road. But at night, with no streetlights, it gets pitch black out there. My car at the time was nothing fancy, just an old 1998 Honda Civic that got me where I needed to go. The headlights weren't great, which is why I always used my high beams on that stretch. No other cars around most of the time, so I didn't have to worry about blinding anyone. So I'm cruising down this road, maybe going 45 mph, radio playing some forgettable rock song, when I notice something beside one of those wooden utility poles about 100 yards ahead. At first, I thought it was just someone standing there, which was weird enough at that hour in the middle of nowhere. My first thought was maybe someone had car trouble or something, so I slowed down a bit. As I got closer, something felt off. You know that feeling when your brain is trying to make sense of something that doesn't fit? That's what was happening. This wasn't a person, at least not any kind of person I'd ever seen before. I slowed down even more, probably to about 20 mph, partly out of curiosity and partly because something in my gut was telling me to be cautious. The high beams were illuminating it better now, and I could see that whatever was standing there was huge. Not just tall, but massive. Broad shoulders that had to be at least twice the width of a normal man's. The thing that really hit me, though, was that it was covered in what looked like thick black hair, or fur. Not clothes. Actual hair growing from its body. The hair wasn't super long, but it covered everything I could see, and at the top of its head, the hair kind of came to a point, almost like a natural crest or something. I was maybe 30 feet away when I noticed its hands. They were different from the rest of it. They seemed to have less hair, almost bare-looking. I couldn't see its feet because of some tall grass near the base of the pole, but based on its proportions, they had to be massive too. Using that utility pole as a reference, those things are what, 30, 35 feet tall? This thing had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall, maybe even taller. It was just standing there, not moving much, kind of like it was observing something in the woods. My car was almost past it when it turned its head and looked directly at me, just for a second, but that was enough. I couldn't make out its facial features clearly. It was too dark, and everything happened so fast, but I felt those eyes on me. It's hard to explain, but it felt aware, intelligent, not like an animal startled by headlights, more like a person who notices you but doesn't really care. After that brief look, it just turned its head back toward the woods, completely unconcerned by my presence. That moment of eye contact sent an electric shock through my entire body. The hair on my arms stood straight up, and I felt this cold wave wash over me from head to toe. I've never experienced anything like it before or since. This primal, instinctive fear response that bypassed all rational thought. I didn't scream or anything dramatic. I just hit the gas, hard. My little Civic lurched forward, and I got the hell out of there as fast as my car could manage on that dark, winding road. I didn't look in my rearview mirror. Some part of my brain didn't want to know if it was following me or watching me drive away. The next few miles are a blur. I was gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white, and I was breathing like I'd just run a marathon. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Was it a bear? No way. Bears don't stand like that, and it was way too tall. Someone in a costume? Out in the middle of nowhere at night, standing silently by a utility pole? That made even less sense. When I finally got home to my apartment, I locked the door behind me and just sat on my couch in the dark for a while. I didn't turn on the TV or grab that snack I'd been thinking about. I just sat there, replaying those few seconds over and over in my head, trying to convince myself I'd seen something explainable. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing turning to look at me. I kept hearing noises outside my window, normal apartment complex sounds that suddenly seemed threatening. At one point around 3 a.m., I actually got up and checked that my doors and windows were locked again, feeling ridiculous but unable to help myself. The next morning, in the harsh light of day, I almost managed to convince myself I'd been seeing things. Maybe it was exhaustion from working and studying. Maybe it was shadows playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew what I saw was real. That brief moment of eye contact wasn't something my tired mind could have invented. I thought about driving back to that spot in the daylight to look for tracks or other evidence, but something held me back. Fear, probably. Not just fear of potentially encountering it again, but fear of finding nothing and having to face the possibility that I was losing my mind. For weeks afterward, I took the long way home, adding about 25 minutes to my commute just to avoid Ashbury Road. Eventually, I started using the shortcut again, but only during daylight hours. To this day, more than 18 years later, I've never driven down that stretch of road after dark again. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw for a long time. Who would believe me? It sounds crazy even to me, and I'm the one who saw it. When I finally mentioned it to my buddy Mike about a year later, he looked at me like I'd grown a second head and then tried to convince me it was probably just a guy in a ghillie suit or something. After that, I kept it to myself. It wasn't until years later that I started researching online and found other accounts of similar sightings, not just in the Pacific Northwest where you'd expect them, but all over, including some in Delaware and the surrounding states. People describing tall, hair-covered bipedal creatures in wooded areas. Some accounts matched details of what I saw so closely it gave me chills all over again. The thing is, I was never a believer in Bigfoot or Sasquatch before this. I thought those stories were just myths or misidentifications. Hell, I used to laugh at those blurry photos and TV shows about people hunting for them. Now, I don't know what to think. I'm not saying that's definitely what I saw, but I can't explain it any other way. What haunts me most isn't just the physical appearance of the thing, though that was disturbing enough. It's the way it looked at me with what felt like intelligence and then dismissed me as unimportant. Like I was just another animal passing through its territory, not worth bothering with. There was something deeply unsettling about that. About being sized up by something that shouldn't exist, according to everything I'd been taught about the natural world. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, hanging around those woods off Ashbury Road. If it's watching other cars pass by at night, briefly turning to observe the humans inside before going back to whatever it was doing. The thought makes me uneasy, even all these years later. I still live in Delaware, though in a different town now. I've got a normal life, a wife, a kid, a mortgage, a steady job. Most days, I don't think about what happened that night, but sometimes, when I'm driving past wooded areas after dark, my eyes can't help but scan the tree line. And when we go hiking as a family, I'm always the one insisting we get back to the car before sunset. My wife thinks I'm just being cautious, and I've never told her the real reason. How do you tell someone you love that you're worried about encountering a creature that supposedly doesn't exist? That you've seen something that challenges everything we're taught about what's real and what isn't. So I keep it to myself mostly, this strange experience that changed how I see the world. I don't know what was standing by that utility pole on Ashbury Road that night in 2004. I don't know if it was dangerous or just curious. All I know is what I saw, and that brief moment when our eyes met and something ancient and wild looked back at me. I still take the long way home. Story 8. I'll never forget what happened on that sticky summer evening outside of Hope. And no, I don't mean that metaphorically. I literally mean Hope, Arkansas. It was late August 2021, and the air still had that heavy, wet blanket feeling that hangs around until September down here. Me and my buddy Jake were standing on this country road, waiting for his cousin Matt to pick us up. Jake's truck had broken down earlier that day, something with the transmission, and Matt was our ride back to town. We'd been waiting maybe 20 minutes, and the sun was starting to sink behind the trees. Just for context, this wasn't some main highway. It was one of those narrow, patchy asphalt roads where the yellow line is more suggestion than rule. On our right was dense woods, and across the road was this massive watermelon field. You know how Hope is famous for watermelons? This was one of those fields. During the day it would have been picturesque, but as the light faded, those rows of vines started looking, I don't know, unsettling. We had Jake's 2 dogs with us, a black lab named Diesel, and this scrappy terrier mix called Bandit. They'd been playing around, doing normal dog stuff, sniffing the roadside and occasionally wrestling with each other. Nothing weird. I remember checking my phone. It was 7:42 p.m. I was getting antsy because Matt was running late and we were losing daylight fast. That's when I first got that feeling. You know, the one where your brain just screams that something's watching you. You feel that? I asked Jake. He nodded without looking at me. Yeah, something doesn't feel right. We both started scanning the area. The watermelon field stretched out for what looked like a quarter mile, ending at a line of oak trees that marked the boundary of the property. That's when I saw it. Something tall standing behind one of the bigger oaks at the edge of the field. At first I thought it was just a shadow or maybe a dead tree, but then I realized it was moving slightly, not walking or anything dramatic, just the subtle shifting of weight you see when someone's trying to stay still but can't quite manage it. Jake, I said, keeping my voice low for some reason, look over there by that big oak at the edge of the field. Jake squinted in that direction. I saw the exact moment he spotted it because his whole body tensed up. What the hell is that? He whispered. Before I could answer, both dogs went absolutely ballistic. 1 second they were calm. The next, they were in full freak-out mode. Diesel's hackles shot up like I'd never seen before, and he started this deep, throaty bark that didn't sound like his normal bark at all. Bandit was even worse. He was running back and forth on the road, growling and whining in this panicked way. Jake grabbed for Diesel's collar, but the lad was too worked up. Both dogs were facing the watermelon field, absolutely fixated on something. And that's when we heard it. I've spent a lot of time outdoors. I've heard bears, cougars, even the weird screams foxes make that sound like a woman being murdered. Nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, has ever sounded like what came from that watermelon patch. It started as this low rumble, almost below what I could hear, more like something I could feel in my chest. Then it built into this growl. Calling it a growl doesn't do it justice. It was deeper than a bear's, more resonant, and it had this quality to it that felt almost intelligent. Like it wasn't just an animal noise, but a deliberate warning. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. It vibrated up through the ground and into my bones. It filled the air around us like it was alive. And it went on for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10-15 seconds. The dogs went from aggressive to terrified in an instant. Diesel tucked his tail and pressed against Jake's legs. Bandit actually pissed himself right there on the road. I've never experienced fear like that. It wasn't the jump scare kind you get from horror movies. It was primal. Every cell in my body was screaming, "Run!" So we did. We completely forgot about waiting for Matt. We just ran. Jake yelled something about heading toward the nearest house, which was maybe a half-mile back the way we'd come. The dogs bolted ahead of us, like their lives depended on it. I made the mistake of looking over my shoulder as we ran. That tall shape by the oak tree had moved out into the open just enough that I could see its silhouette better. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, broader than any person I've ever seen. And it was watching us. I couldn't make out features, but I felt its eyes on me. We ran until our lungs burned. Jake's house was about 2 miles away, and we didn't slow down once. The dog stayed right with us the whole time, occasionally looking back with these terrified expressions. We had just reached Jake's driveway when headlights appeared behind us. I nearly shit myself until Jake recognized his cousin's truck. Matt pulled up looking confused as hell, finding us doubled over, gasping for breath. "What the hell happened to y'all?" he asked as he rolled down his window. Between ragged breaths, Jake tried to explain. "Something. By the watermelon field. Big, made this sound." Matt's expression changed from confused to dead serious. "You saw something tall by Old Man Henderson's watermelon patch?" We nodded. "And it made some kind of noise at you?" "A growl," I managed to say, "but not like any animal I've ever heard." Matt shut off his truck. "Get inside, now!" Once in Jake's house, we locked the doors and drew the blinds. Matt didn't seem surprised by our story at all, which was almost as unsettling as what had happened. "People around here don't talk about it much with outsiders," Matt explained. "I should mention I'm not from Hope originally. I moved there for work about 2 years before this happened. But there's been stories about something in these woods for generations. My granddaddy used to call it the Woods Booger." "Woods Booger," I repeated. "Local name for Bigfoot," Jake said quietly. "I always thought they were just stories to scare kids." Matt shook his head. "My dad saw one when he was about our age. Said it was picking through a watermelon patch at night. And when I was in high school, something followed me and Jeff home from fishing one night. Never saw it clearly, but it broke branches that were way too high up for a person. I wasn't sure what to believe. Part of me wanted to rationalize. Maybe it was a bear on its hind legs. Maybe the growl was some kind of farm equipment in the distance. But deep down, I knew better. Bears don't stand still and watch you from the edge of fields. Farm equipment doesn't make noises that turn brave dogs into trembling messes. We decided to drive over to their uncle's place about 20 minutes away. Safety in numbers, I guess. Their Uncle Travis was this gruff, no-nonsense guy who'd worked as a game warden for decades. If anyone would know what to make of our experience, it would be him. When we told him, he didn't laugh or dismiss us. He just got real quiet, then said, "You boys were lucky. It was warning you. If it wanted to hurt you, you wouldn't have made it to the road." Travis shared his own story from the 80s when he found a deer carcass 15 feet up in a tree while on patrol. The way he described it, broken, not eaten, made my skin crawl. He believed whatever lived in those woods wasn't necessarily malevolent, but it was territorial and powerful. He ended up driving us back to Jake's place around midnight. We were too shaken to go back alone. That night was the longest of my life. Around 2 a.m., we started hearing these weird whistles from the woods behind Jake's house. Not like human whistling, more like some kind of signal or language. Sometimes a single note, sometimes a pattern. And once, around 4 a.m., a howl that made the window seem to vibrate slightly. The dogs wouldn't stop pacing and whining. We kept all the lights on and took turns watching out the windows, though none of us seriously considered going outside. Travis had brought his shotgun in from his truck and left it with us, but he'd been clear. This won't help you much if it decides to come for you. Best defense is to stay inside and leave it be. The noises finally stopped around dawn. I don't think any of us got more than a few minutes of sleep. In the harsh light of morning, it was tempting to write the whole thing off as an overreaction. Maybe we'd seen a deer or a bear. Maybe the growl was something mundane that fear had transformed in our minds. But then I looked at Jake's dogs. Diesel, who would chase down anything without hesitation, refused to go outside to pee until Jake physically carried him off the porch. And Bandit, who normally couldn't shut up to save his life, stayed unnaturally quiet for days afterward. I've tried to research what happened to us. I've gone down countless internet rabbit holes about Bigfoot sightings in Arkansas. Some accounts sound similar to ours, especially ones from the Fook area about the Boggy Creek monster. But nothing quite captures the sound we heard, or the absolute certainty I felt that whatever was watching us from that field wasn't human. It's been nearly 2 years now. Jake and I don't talk about it much, but I know he thinks about it as often as I do. I've never gone back to that stretch of road, and I've found myself avoiding watermelon fields entirely. Whatever was in those woods that evening, it changed something fundamental in me. I used to feel comfortable in nature, like I belonged there. Now I understand that I'm just a visitor, and not always a welcome one. There are things in this world that we've forgotten how to see. Things that don't want to be seen except on their own terms. Sometimes at night, when I'm half asleep, I swear I can still feel that growl vibrating in my chest. And I wonder if it's still out there, standing at the edge of fields, watching and waiting. Story 9. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that summer day in 2000. It's been over 20 years, but I can close my eyes and be right back there in those woods near Lake Tenkiller. I was 30 then, visiting my grandfather's property in Cherokee County, Oklahoma, with my stepfather Rick and my buddy Chris. The property had been in our family for decades, but nobody had really done anything with it. My mum had inherited it after my grandfather passed, and Rick thought we should at least clear a proper access road so we could maybe use it for camping or hunting. It was pretty remote, about 3 miles from the nearest paved road, down this overgrown dirt track that was barely wide enough for Rick's pickup. We arrived around 8 a.m. that Saturday morning. The humidity hit me like a wall when I stepped out of the air-conditioned truck. That Oklahoma summer heat was no joke. Had to be pushing 90 degrees already, and it wasn't even 9 o'clock. Rick had brought chainsaws, machetes, and those long-handled clippers for clearing the brush. The plan was to widen the existing path enough to get vehicles in without scratching them all to hell on the brambles and branches. While Rick and Chris fired up the chainsaws to start tackling some fallen trees blocking the path, I decided to explore a bit. I'd only been to the property once or twice as a kid, and I barely remembered it. Rick just nodded when I said I was going to look around. He was focused on the task at hand, and probably glad to have one less person in the way. The property was about 40 acres of mostly hardwood forest, oak trees, hickory, some maple, typical for that part of Oklahoma. The undergrowth was thick in places, and I had to push through brambles and bushes as I made my way deeper into the property. I remember the constant buzz of cicadas and the occasional rustle in the undergrowth as small animals scurried away from my footsteps. I was probably a quarter-mile from where we'd parked when I noticed the land starting to slope downward. Following what looked like a game trail, I kept going until I realized I was at the edge of a pretty steep ravine. It must have dropped a good 50 or 60 feet to the bottom, where I could see a small creek trickling through. The sides were rocky in places, with exposed limestone and shale, but there were enough trees and roots to make climbing down possible if you were careful. Something about that ravine pulled at me. I don't know if it was curiosity or just the adventure of exploring somewhere new, but I decided to make my way down. Grabbing onto tree trunks and roots, I half climbed, half slid down the incline. My boots kept slipping on the loose soil, sending small avalanches of dirt and pebbles down before me. By the time I reached the bottom, my jeans were filthy, and my t-shirt was soaked with sweat. The temperature was noticeably cooler at the bottom of the ravine. The canopy of trees overhead blocked most of the sun, and the air felt damp near the creek. I followed the water for maybe 100 yards when something caught my eye on the opposite bank. There, in the rocky face of the ravine wall, were two openings, caves, about 20 feet apart from each other. Now, I'd never heard anything about caves on our property. I splashed across the shallow creek, my boots squishing with water as I approached the larger of the two openings. It was about 6 feet tall and maybe 4 feet wide, big enough to walk into without stooping. The smaller one, off to the right, was more like a crevice, maybe 3 feet high. You'd have to crawl to get in there. I stood at the entrance of the larger cave, peering into the darkness. The temperature dropped even more here, and I felt that cool air flowing out against my sweaty skin. I didn't have a flashlight, but enough daylight filtered in to see maybe 15 feet into the cave. The floor was sandy with some small rocks scattered about. The ceiling looked stable enough, no obvious signs of recent cave-ins or anything. I hesitated for a moment. Growing up in Oklahoma, you learn pretty quick about the dangers of unexplored caves, snakes, spiders, unstable rock formations. But my curiosity won out. I stepped inside, giving my eyes a minute to adjust to the dimmer light. The cave widened as I moved deeper, opening into a chamber maybe 20 feet across, and that's when I saw it. This massive nest-like structure taking up a good portion of the floor space. It was circular, about 6 feet in diameter, with a depression in the middle, like a giant bird's nest. But what really got to me was what it was made of. I crouched down to get a better look. The nest was constructed of all sorts of materials. The base seemed to be made of twisted branches and grasses, but woven throughout were unmistakably man-made items. There were shreds of what looked like a blue sleeping bag, strips of cloth that might have once been a shirt or jacket, and even bits of plastic shopping bags. The middle was lined with softer materials, leaves, more grass, even what looked like stuffing from a pillow or cushion. My first thought was that some homeless person had been living there, but something felt off. The construction didn't seem human. It was too circular, too precisely formed. And the way the materials were woven together, it reminded me more of how a bird or rodent would build a nest, not how a person would make a bed. Around the perimeter of the nest were food wrappers, beef jerky packages, candy bar wrappers, even a crushed Mountain Dew can. Some looked relatively fresh, others were faded and weather-worn. I picked up one of the jerky packages. The expiration date was just a few months prior. That's when I noticed the smell. It had been there since I entered, but I hadn't really registered it. A musky animal odor, like wet dog, but stronger, with something else underneath I couldn't quite place. Not exactly rotting, but wild, primal. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. Whatever had built this nest wasn't small. The depression in the middle was big enough for a large man to curl up in. And whatever it was, it had been here recently. I backed away from the nest, suddenly very aware of how alone I was. The only sounds were the dripping of water somewhere deeper in the cave and my own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. I decided I'd seen enough. As I turned to leave, my foot kicked something that skittered across the cave floor with a clinking sound. I bent down to see what it was. A button, a simple brown button like from a flannel shirt. Nothing remarkable, except for what was next to it, a clump of hair. A lot of hair, actually, reddish-brown in color. At first I thought it might be from a deer or bear, but it was too long, too coarse. I picked it up, running it through my fingers. It was at least 4 to 5 inches long, and there was a lot of it, like something had shed or been groomed right there. That was enough for me. I dropped the hair and made my way quickly back to the cave entrance, squinting as I emerged into the comparatively brighter light of the ravine. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, telling myself I was overreacting, probably just some animal's den. Maybe a bear, though bears weren't common in this part of Oklahoma. Could be some kids had found the cave and used it as a hangout spot. I was about to start the climb back up the ravine when I heard it, a sound that froze me in place. A deep, guttural huffing noise, like an animal snorting or clearing its nostrils. My head snapped up, scanning the opposite side of the ravine, the direction the sound had come from. That's when I saw it. About 30 feet up the ravine wall, partially obscured by a tree, was a head and shoulders watching me. My first irrational thought was that someone else was exploring the property, but as I focused on the figure, I realized what I was seeing wasn't human, at least not entirely. The head was large, set directly on broad shoulders with seemingly no neck. It was covered in the same reddish-brown hair I'd found in the cave. The face, God, the face is what still haunts me, was a disturbing blend of human and ape. The brow ridge was prominent, the nose flat and wide, but the eyes were what got me. They were set deep under that brow, but they were undeniably intelligent, aware, and they were fixed directly on me. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, we stared at each other. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Every childhood story about Bigfoot, every late-night documentary I'd laughed at, none of it seemed funny now, because I knew with absolute certainty that's what I was looking at. The creature shifted slightly, moving one massive hand to grip a tree trunk. That broke my paralysis. I turned and ran, splashing through the creek, not caring about the slippery rocks or the water filling my boots. Pure adrenaline propelled me up the ravine wall. I grabbed at roots, tree trunks, anything to pull myself upward. Loose dirt gave way under my feet, but fear kept me scrambling upward. My jeans tore at the knee when I snagged them on a branch, but I barely noticed. I kept glancing back, terrified I'd see the creature climbing after me, but the ravine wall behind me remained empty. When I finally reached the top, I didn't stop. I ran through the forest, branches whipping my face, thorns tearing at my arms. I could hear my own voice, realizing I was yelling for Rick, for Chris, for anyone. I burst into the clearing where we'd been working, gasping for breath, covered in dirt and sweat. Rick and Chris looked up from where they were cutting branches, faces showing confusion at my panic. "What the hell happened to you?" Rick asked, turning off his chainsaw. Between gulps of air, I told them what I'd seen, the cave, the nest, the creature watching me from the ravine wall. With each detail, their expressions changed from concern to disbelief, and finally to amusement. "A Bigfoot? Seriously?" Chris laughed, exchanging a glance with Rick. "Man, you must have been out in the sun too long." "I know what I saw," I insisted, my voice cracking with emotion. "It was right there watching me. And that nest, something's living in that cave. Something big." Rick sighed, setting down his chainsaw completely. "Nathan, There's no such thing as Bigfoot. Probably just a black bear you saw. They can look pretty human-like when they stand up." "It wasn't a bear," I said firmly. "I've seen bears. This was something else." But they wouldn't believe me. No matter how I described it, no matter how I pointed out that bears aren't commonly found in that area, they had already decided I was either exaggerating or had been spooked by something ordinary and misidentified it. "Show us then," Chris challenged. "Take us to this cave." For a moment I considered it, but the thought of going back down into that ravine, of potentially encountering that creature again, I couldn't do it. The fear was too raw, too real. "I'm not going back there," I said quietly. That sealed it for them. Rick just shook his head, and Chris smirked. They went back to work, occasionally throwing glances my way, probably wondering if I was going to freak out again. We stayed another few hours, clearing brush and widening the path. I helped, but my mind wasn't on the work. Every snap of a twig in the forest made me jump. Every rustle of leaves had me scanning the tree line. I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. We had planned to come back the following weekend to continue clearing, but we never did. I made excuses. Work was busy, my back was acting up. Anything to avoid returning to that property. Eventually, Rick gave up asking. My mum still owns that land. The deed sits in a filing cabinet in her house, a piece of paper claiming ownership over a place I don't think any human truly possesses. No one in our family has been back since that day. I've never told my mum why I won't go there anymore. She probably thinks it's just laziness or lack of interest. I've been to Lake Tenkiller many times since then. It's a beautiful area, popular for fishing and camping. Occasionally, I'll hear locals talk about strange sightings in the woods, unusual noises at night, or finding large, unidentifiable tracks. I listen but rarely contribute to these conversations. Sometimes, someone will explicitly mention Bigfoot, usually with a laugh or a wink. Before my experience, I would have joined in their skepticism. Now I just stay quiet. I'm 52 now. I've tried over the years to convince myself that Rick and Chris were right, that I saw a bear, or maybe just a large man living off the grid. I've read about how the human mind can play tricks, especially in stressful or unfamiliar situations. I've looked up every animal native to eastern Oklahoma, trying to find something that matches what I saw. But in my heart, I know what I saw that day wasn't anything recognized by science. Those eyes looking at me, they knew I had found its home. They were assessing me, determining if I was a threat. Sometimes I wonder, what would have happened if I had frozen instead of running? Or worse, if I'd gone back to that cave a second time? I've never told this story publicly before. Most people would react just like Rick and Chris did. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself thinking about that creature, wondering if it's still there, using that cave, building its nest with whatever materials it can find. And I wonder if it remembers me. The human who stumbled upon its sanctuary that hot summer day and ran away screaming. Story 10. I never thought I'd be writing this out, but after all these years, I feel like I need to get this off my chest. Back in September 1984, something happened to me and my friend Linda that completely changed how I see the world. I'm still processing it almost 40 years later. Linda and I were in our early 20s then, full of energy and adventure. We loved hiking in the Sierra Nevada mountains above Lake Tahoe. That specific weekend, we decided to explore a trail near Genoa, Nevada, overlooking Carson Valley. The weather was perfect, that beautiful early fall crispness in the air, not too hot anymore, but still sunny with that golden September light filtering through the pine trees. We got to the trailhead around 10 a.m. I remember checking my watch because we wanted to make sure we had plenty of daylight for the hike. The trail was pretty strenuous, lots of switchbacks climbing up the mountainside. We'd packed sandwiches, apples, some granola bars, and plenty of water. Linda brought her recorder too. You know, that wooden flute-like instrument they make you learn in elementary school. She'd actually gotten pretty good at it and would play these little tunes when we'd take breaks. About 30 minutes into our hike, we encountered these two teenage boys. Couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, literally running down the trail. They looked spooked, almost tripping over themselves. As they got closer, the taller one shouted, "You guys need to turn around. There's a monster up there." His friend was nodding frantically behind him, out of breath. Linda and I just looked at each other and rolled our eyes. I mean, come on, monster. Really, we figured they were either messing with us or had taken something. Maybe they'd seen a bear or mountain lion and freaked out. The 80s were wild times, and we just assumed they were high on something. "What kind of monster?" I asked, trying not to laugh. "Like huge, hairy. It was watching us from the trees," the shorter one said, still panting. We thanked them for the warning, but kept going. The trail got steeper and we settled into that rhythm you find on a good hike. Focusing on your breathing, the sound of your boots on the dirt, little conversations that trail off and pick back up again. After about 2 hours of steady climbing, we reached this old deer hunter's cabin that was known as a halfway marker up the mountain. It wasn't much, just a simple wooden structure with a small covered porch. The door was padlocked, but the porch offered a nice place to sit and rest. We ate our sandwiches there, taking in the view of Carson Valley sprawled out below us. It was breathtaking. You could see for miles, little houses and roads looking like a miniature model from that height. Linda took out her recorder and played a few folk tunes while I stretched out my legs and ate an apple. The wind had picked up a bit, rustling through the pines around us. After resting for maybe half an hour, we decided to explore the area around the cabin before heading back down. There was a small creek about 50 yards away, and the ground around it was littered with beautiful pine cones. I suggested we gather some. I was into crafting back then and thought they'd make nice Christmas decorations. So there we were, wandering around this little creek, picking up pine cones and dropping them into Linda's backpack, when suddenly Linda's voice cut through the quiet. "Oh my God, it's a bear." There was this pause that still gives me chills when I think about it. Then, "No, it's a guy in a bear suit." I turned around to see what she was looking at, and my whole body just froze. Standing maybe 20 yards away, partly obscured by a pine tree, was something I still can't fully explain. It was tall, 7 feet at least, and covered in hair the color of dry pine needles, this reddish-brown that blended perfectly with the surrounding forest. The hair seemed thinner on its chest and face, which is why I think Linda initially thought it might be someone in a costume. But this was no costume. No human could have moved the way this thing did. It had this incredibly broad chest and shoulders, much wider than any human I've ever seen. The arms were disproportionately long, hands, if you can call them that, hanging almost to its knees. It was standing upright, completely bipedal, watching us with an intensity that I can still feel when I close my eyes. What happened next defies everything I thought I knew about fear, because I wasn't afraid, not exactly. There was this rush of adrenaline, yes, but also this overwhelming sense of wonder, fascination. The creature and I locked eyes, and I felt this bizarre connection, like we were equally curious about each other. Its face is what I remember most vividly. It resembled an orangutan somewhat, but more, I don't know, human-like. It had these large eyes, dark but deeply expressive, set under a prominent brow ridge. The nose was flat and wide, the mouth relatively small compared to the rest of its features. There was an intelligence there, an awareness that was unmistakable. Its expression was almost serene, observant. We all stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably just seconds. Then it moved. It turned slightly and began walking up a steep slope covered in loose pine needles. This is something that has stuck with me all these years, the way it moved. Any human trying to climb that slope would have been slipping and struggling, grabbing at trees for support. This creature took these long, confident strides, never once losing its footing on the slippery surface. And the whole time it kept its gaze fixed on us, turning its head without breaking stride. Linda grabbed my arm so hard I had bruises the next day. "Melissa, we need to go. Now," she whispered, her voice shaking. I couldn't move at first. I was transfixed. There was something about this creature that didn't feel threatening. If anything, it seemed curious, maybe even cautious of us. But Linda was tugging me backward, and finally I snapped out of it and started moving. We didn't run. That's important to note. Everything I've ever learned about wildlife told me not to run from predators, though whether this qualified as wildlife was a question I couldn't begin to answer. We backed away slowly, then turned and began descending the trail at a fast walk. The truly unnerving part came next. As we made our way down the switchbacks of the trail, I kept glancing up at the ridge above us. The creature was paralleling our path, moving through the trees along the top of the ridge, keeping pace with us. It was always there, just watching, following along at a distance but never approaching. My heart was pounding the whole time, not from exertion, but from this overwhelming mix of emotions I couldn't sort through. Fear, yes, some. Awe, definitely. Disbelief, absolutely. I kept thinking, this can't be happening, but there it was. This impossible being keeping pace above us. We made it back to our truck in record time. As I fumbled with the keys, I looked back up the mountain one last time. The creature was perched on a granite boulder about 100 yards away, crouching slightly, still watching us. I don't know what possessed me, but I called out, "That was cool, but you really shouldn't be scaring people like that." My voice echoed across the distance between us. The creature stood up to its full height then, and Linda practically screamed at me, "Are you insane? Get in the truck!" She was already in the passenger seat, reaching across to tug at my jacket. I got in, started the engine, and we drove away. In the rearview mirror, I could see it still standing there on that boulder, watching us leave. For the first few miles, we didn't speak. Then Linda finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think we just saw Bigfoot." She laughed, this high, nervous sound. "That's not possible." "You saw it too," I reminded her. We spent the drive back to Reno trying to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was someone in a really good costume. But no costume could explain the way it moved, the natural agility it showed on that steep slope. A bear standing upright, not with those proportions, that gait. We went through every possible explanation and rejected them all. The weirdest part was that I felt drawn back there. Over the next few years, I returned to that trail maybe half a dozen times, sometimes with Linda, sometimes alone, though she thought I was crazy for going back solo. We never saw the creature again, at least not clearly. But there were moments, rustling in the dense underbrush just off the trail, the sensation of being watched, once even what sounded like wood knocking against wood deeper in the forest. About 3 years after our encounter, during one of these return trips, we discovered something that still gives me goosebumps. Near where we'd first seen the creature, we found what looked like a natural shelter, a large boulder surrounded by pine trees, with low-hanging branches that created a kind of enclosed space. The pine needles inside this shelter were flattened and compressed, like something had been sitting or lying there repeatedly. There were no beer cans, cigarette butts, or any other signs of human visitors. I've never told many people about this experience. Linda and I made a pact early on to keep it mostly to ourselves. Who would believe us anyway? We'd be labeled as attention seekers, hoaxers, or just plain crazy. So I've carried this story quietly for decades now. I know what I saw that day. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a costume, wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist according to science, but does. Something intelligent, curious, and adapted perfectly to life in those mountains. Sometimes, when I'm falling asleep at night, I still see those eyes looking at me. Not threatening, not angry, just aware. Aware and intelligent, and as curious about me as I was about it. The area where we saw it, we later heard locals unofficially call it Bigfoot Canyon. Maybe they knew something too. Maybe there have been other sightings over the years that never made the papers or got reported to authorities. All I know is that day changed me. It opened my mind to possibilities I'd never considered before. If this creature exists, what else might be out there that we don't understand? What other secrets do the mountains and forests hold? I still hike regularly, but I never go into the woods now without feeling like I'm being watched. Not in a threatening way, just observed, noted. And occasionally, when I'm deep in the backcountry and the wind dies down completely, I'll hear something moving through the trees that doesn't sound like any animal I know. Something bipedal, something large, something careful. And I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 11. I've read so many stories on this forum, and I never thought I'd be posting one of my own, but I need to get this off my chest, because it's been eating at me for years. I still don't know exactly what I saw that night, but I know what I experienced was real. This happened during 4th of July weekend in 2019. My friend Rachel has this family cabin near Asheville, North Carolina, tucked away in this gorgeous wooded area. She invited me and 3 other friends, Jason, Megan, and Kyle, for the holiday weekend. I was super excited because I'd never been to the Appalachians before, and Rachel always talked about how peaceful it was up there. The cabin itself was pretty rustic but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and this awesome deck that wrapped around the back with a view of nothing but trees. The property backed up against this dense forest with hiking trails and a small creek running through it. It was exactly what I needed after a stressful few months at work. The first couple days were amazing. We hiked, grilled out, played board games, and just enjoyed being away from our phones and regular life. On the 4th, we drove into Asheville to watch the fireworks display. The town was packed with tourists and locals, everyone in these patriotic outfits, kids running around with sparklers. It was the perfect small-town America vibe. After the fireworks ended around 10 p.m., we headed back to Rachel's cabin. We were all still pretty amped up, probably from the combination of beer, the beautiful night, and just being young and stupid. On the drive back, Kyle suggested we should camp out in the woods behind the cabin instead of sleeping inside. We all thought it was a great idea. Well, seemed like it at the time. Once we got back, we grabbed sleeping bags, a couple tents, some flashlights, and a cooler with more drinks. Rachel knew a small clearing about a 5-minute walk from the cabin that would be perfect. It was around 11:30 p.m. when we started setting up the campsite. The night was warm but not uncomfortable, and the moon was bright enough that we could see pretty well even without our flashlights. We got a small fire going in this little fire pit that was already there. Rachel said her family used this spot all the time. We were laughing, telling ghost stories like we were at some middle school sleepover and passing around a bottle of whiskey. Everything was normal, fun even. Around midnight, I needed to pee, like really badly. I didn't want to just go right next to our campsite, so I told everyone I was going to walk back toward the cabin and use the bathroom there. Jason offered to come with me, but I insisted I was fine. I had my phone for a flashlight, and I knew the path well enough by that point. "I'll be back in 5 minutes," I said, waving them off. "Save me some whiskey." I started walking back along this narrow dirt path that connected the clearing to the cabin. The trees on either side were tall and dense, creating this tunnel effect. With just my phone's flashlight, I could only see maybe 15 feet ahead of me. It was darker than I expected once I got away from the campfire, but I wasn't scared, just focused on not tripping over any roots. I'd walked for about a minute when I heard a rustling sound ahead of me. At first, I thought it was probably just a raccoon or maybe a deer. We'd seen plenty of wildlife during our hikes. I slowed down and pointed my phone light toward the sound. That's when I saw it. About 20 feet in front of me, crossing the path from right to left, was this figure. Even now, typing this out, my hands are shaking. It was massive, not just tall but broad, covered in dark matted hair. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. The thing that struck me most were its arms. They hung down way lower than a person should, almost to its knees. I froze, completely froze. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like time slowed down. The creature was moving with this weird, fluid gait. Not quite like a person walking, but not like an animal either. It was bipedal, definitely on 2 legs, but there was something off about how it moved. Then it stopped. It must have heard me or sensed me somehow, because it stopped right in the middle of the path and turned its head toward me. I couldn't make out its face clearly in the darkness, but I could see its eyes catch the light from my phone. They reflected back, not like a deer's or cat's eyes, but there was definitely a gleam. And I swear to God it looked directly at me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a couple of seconds. Then I involuntarily made this small, gasping sound. It wasn't even a scream, just this pathetic little gasp of terror. That sound seemed to break the moment. The creature turned its head back and continued across the path, disappearing into the trees on the other side. It moved quickly, but didn't run or seem startled. It was like I wasn't worth bothering with. As soon as it was out of sight, my body unfroze, and pure panic hit me. I dropped my phone, just straight up dropped it without even realizing, and ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, back toward the campsite. I wasn't thinking about anything except getting back to my friends. I tripped twice, scraping my knee badly the second time, but I barely felt it. When I burst into the clearing, my friends all jumped up. I must have looked insane, wild-eyed, gasping for breath, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't even get words out at first. "Lisa, what happened?" Rachel grabbed my shoulders. "Are you okay? Did someone attack you?" I shook my head, still struggling to breathe. There was something on the path." "What do you mean, something?" Kyle looked concerned, but also skeptical. "Like an animal?" "No, I don't know. It was huge, standing upright, hairy." I was trembling so hard I could barely stand. It looked at me. They all exchanged glances. I could tell they thought I was overreacting or had freaked myself out in the dark. "It was probably just a bear," Megan said, trying to sound reassuring. "They stand up sometimes." "It wasn't a bear," I insisted, my voice cracking. "It was walking on 2 legs the whole time. It was shaped like a person, but not, and it was at least 7 feet tall." "Where's your phone?" Jason asked, noticing my empty hands. "I dropped it on the path when I ran." Jason and Kyle looked at each other and nodded. "We'll go check it out and find your phone," Kyle said, grabbing his flashlight. "You stay here with Rachel and Megan." "Don't go!" I grabbed Jason's arm. "Please don't go out there." "We'll be fine," Jason assured me. "We'll just grab your phone and come right back. We won't go far." I couldn't convince them not to go, and part of me was hoping they would see it too, so I wouldn't seem crazy. Rachel and Megan sat me down by the fire and gave me water. I was still shaking, and my knee was bleeding from the fall, which Megan cleaned with our first aid kit. About 10 minutes later, Jason and Kyle returned. Kyle was holding my phone. "Found it about 100 yards down the path," he said, handing it to me. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. We didn't see anything out there. No bears, no monsters, nothing. "We looked for tracks, too," Jason added. "Ground's pretty hard, though. Didn't see anything unusual." I could tell they didn't believe me. They thought I'd seen a shadow or a deer and panicked, but I know what I saw. "I want to go back to the cabin," I said firmly. "I'm not sleeping out here." No one argued. Rachel offered to walk back with me, and Megan decided to come too. The guys stayed to pack up the campsite, saying they'd join us shortly. I felt bad for ruining everyone's night, but there was no way I was staying in those woods. The walk back to the cabin was terrible. Every noise made me jump. Rachel kept her arm around my shoulders the whole time, but I could tell she was just humoring me. Inside the cabin, I locked all the doors and windows. Rachel and Megan exchanged looks, but didn't say anything. I took the couch in the living room while Rachel and Megan went to their beds. There was no way I was sleeping in the back bedroom with its big windows facing the forest. The guys came back about 30 minutes later with all our camping gear. They tried again to convince me it was just a bear, but I shut them down. I just wanted everyone to go to sleep so I could stop talking about it. But I didn't sleep, not 1 minute that night. Around 3 a.m., I heard something outside. It started with the neighbor's dog barking frantically. Not just regular barking, but that high-pitched, scared kind of barking dogs do when they're truly afraid. Then I heard what sounded like heavy footsteps on the property, circling the cabin. There was a scratching sound at one point, like something dragging against the wooden exterior of the house. I was too terrified to look out the windows. I just lay there, eyes wide open, listening. At one point, something knocked over the metal trash cans outside, making a huge clanging noise. I nearly screamed but managed to muffle it with my hand. I wanted to wake the others, but I was too embarrassed. They already thought I was overreacting. Eventually the noises stopped, and the sky started to lighten. As soon as it was fully morning, I packed my stuff and told everyone I wasn't feeling well and wanted to head home early. No one tried very hard to convince me to stay. I think they were all a little freaked out by my behavior. The drive home was a blur. I kept seeing that figure in my mind, the way it moved, those long arms, how it looked right at me. I've never felt so small and vulnerable in my life. Here's the thing. I've never believed in Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. I always thought those stories were made up by attention seekers or people who mistook bears for something else. I was the skeptic in my friend group, the practical one who always had a logical explanation. But what I saw that night wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It moved too naturally, too purposefully. And those eyes, there was intelligence there. Something that recognized me as another thinking being. When I got home, I couldn't stop researching. I found out the Appalachian Mountains, especially around western North Carolina, have a long history of Bigfoot sightings. Some of the descriptions matched what I saw exactly. The height, the long arms, the way it moved. I found online forums where people shared similar experiences, and for the first time, I didn't feel so alone. I haven't told many people about this. My friends from that trip still bring it up sometimes as a joke. Remember when Lisa thought she saw Bigfoot? And I just laugh it off now. It's easier than trying to convince them, but I know what I saw. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear those heavy footsteps outside my window. I've never gone camping since then. I can't even hike in densely wooded areas anymore without feeling watched. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I needed to tell someone who might understand, who wouldn't immediately dismiss me. Whatever that thing was, it's out there. And sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too, the human it locked eyes with on a dark path in the North Carolina woods. Story 12. I've never been the type to believe in the supernatural. Growing up in Vermont, you get used to the woods, the isolation, the darkness. But what happened last winter changed everything for me. I still get chills thinking about it, and I've been hesitant to share this anywhere because I know how it sounds. But I need to tell someone. It was mid-January 2020, right before the whole world went crazy with COVID. My friends and I, there were 4 of us. Me, Jason, Mark, Tyler, and Chris were going stir-crazy from being cooped up all winter. We'd been hanging out at my place in Millbrook playing video games and drinking beers when Tyler suggested we go for a night hike through the woods behind my house. Under normal circumstances, I might have shot down the idea. It was around 11 p.m. and freezing cold, probably in the low teens. But the moon was almost full that night, casting this bright bluish glow over the snow, and honestly, it looked beautiful outside. I've hiked those trails hundreds of times since I was a kid. There's a main path that stretches about 2 miles from the entrance behind my property to another access point near the county road. It's used by snowmobilers in winter and hikers in summer, nothing dangerous. So I said, why not? We bundled up, grabbed our phone flashlights, and I filled a thermos with hot chocolate and maybe a splash of whiskey. It didn't seem like a big deal. Just a quick hike to break the monotony. The snow was deep, maybe 18 inches in some spots, but the trail itself was somewhat packed down from snowshoers and local wildlife. The temperature had dropped even further once we got out there, and our breath was coming out in these huge clouds of vapor. Despite the cold, it felt good to be outside. The woods were quiet in that special way they get in winter, where sound travels forever, but somehow feels muffled at the same time. About half a mile in, Chris started going on about a Bigfoot documentary he'd watched on Netflix. Tyler joined in with some UFO conspiracy theory, and we all started trading stories about weird, unexplained stuff. Just typical bullshit you talk about in the woods at night. I remember laughing at them, telling them the only thing we needed to worry about was moose, which can actually be dangerous if you surprise them. We reached the halfway point, this little wooden bridge that crosses a frozen creek. After about 45 minutes of hiking, Chris wanted to stop for a smoke, so we paused there. That's when I first noticed something felt off. While standing on that bridge, I got this sudden feeling of being watched. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the creepy stories getting to me. As Chris was finishing his cigarette, Tyler pointed out a light further down the trail. It wasn't moving, just a dim glow maybe a quarter mile ahead. I figured it was probably just the reflection of the moon on something, or maybe another group of hikers, though that would be unusual at midnight in January. "Should we check it out?" Mark asked. We decided to continue our hike toward the other entrance, which meant heading toward whatever that light was. As we walked, the light seemed to disappear, which I thought was strange, but not particularly alarming. The trail curved a bit through a denser section of trees, so I assumed the light was just obscured. About 15 minutes later, we heard dogs barking. Not just one dog, but what sounded like several, and they sounded agitated. The barking was coming from the direction of the nearest houses, probably half a mile away, across a field bordering the woods. Something about that barking made the hair on my neck stand up. Dogs don't usually bark like that unless they're alerting to something. "Those dogs sound freaked out," Tyler said, stopping to listen. "Let's pick up the pace a bit," I suggested, suddenly eager to reach the other end of the trail. We started walking faster, but after a few minutes the barking faded and we slowed back down. I remember checking my phone. It was around 12:30 a.m. We were getting close to the other entrance, maybe half a mile away. That's when I first got the unmistakable sense that something was following us, not just watching anymore, but actively tracking us. It's hard to explain the feeling if you've never experienced it, but it's primal. A deep-seated awareness that you're being hunted. I didn't mention it to the others right away because I didn't want to sound paranoid. But then I heard it. A sound like someone slipping in the snow, followed by a muffled thud. It came from behind us, maybe 50 feet back. I turned around, shining my phone light into the darkness, but couldn't see anything beyond the trees lining the trail. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hear what?" Tyler replied. Before I could explain, we heard it again. Another slipping sound, closer this time. I glanced at Mark, who was walking right behind me. "Dude, stop messing around." He looked genuinely confused. "What are you talking about? Are you slipping in the snow or something?" Mark shook his head. "No, I thought that was you." We all stopped and stood completely still, listening. The woods had gone silent. No wind, no distant traffic, no animals, just four of us breathing in the cold air. Then we heard it clearly, footsteps crunching in the snow, not from our group, coming from the dark section of trail we'd just passed through. It wasn't subtle anymore. It sounded like deliberate steps followed by the distinctive crack of breaking branches. "Hello?" Chris called out, his voice echoing slightly. No response. We all turned our phone flashlights toward the sound, but the beams only penetrated so far into the darkness. The footsteps stopped as soon as our lights pointed that way. "Is someone following us?" Tyler whispered. "It's probably just some animal," I said, not believing it myself. The footsteps we'd heard weren't from a deer or fox. They were too heavy, too purposeful. "Let's keep moving," I suggested, trying to stay calm. "We're almost at the other entrance." We continued walking, faster now, all of us periodically glancing back. That's when the first snowball hit a tree right next to my head. At first, I thought a clump of snow had fallen from a branch. Then another one whizzed past Tyler's shoulder, and a third one nearly hit Mark square in the back. "What the fuck?" Tyler shouted, spinning around. "Who's throwing shit at us?" Chris immediately accused me of setting up some kind of prank, which I quickly denied. How could I have orchestrated this? We were 2 miles into the woods in the middle of the night, trudging through deep snow. "Guys, seriously, we need to move," I said, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. "Now!" We started jogging, which wasn't easy in the snow. The trail was slippery, and our boots kept breaking through the crust, causing us to stumble. I remember the burning sensation in my lungs from the frigid air, but fear kept us moving. The sounds behind us continued. Not just footsteps now, but what seemed like multiple sets of footsteps, moving parallel to the trail at times, then crossing back onto it behind us. Whatever was following us was keeping pace without difficulty. After about 10 minutes of jogging, we had to stop to catch our breath. We'd covered maybe half the distance back toward my house. As we stood there, gasping for air, the woods went silent again. No footsteps. Nothing. "Maybe we lost it," Mark whispered hopefully. That's when something heavy landed in the snow directly behind us, causing all four of us to jump and spin around. It looked like a large branch that had been deliberately thrown onto the trail. There was no way it had simply fallen. It had been launched with force from at least 20 feet away in the dense trees. "Run!" I shouted, no longer caring about staying calm. We took off at a sprint, all pretense of composure gone. The journey back was a blur of panic and exertion. I remember my lungs burning, my legs aching, and the constant awareness that whatever was behind us was still there, still following, still watching. The dogs started barking again as we neared the halfway point. The same frantic, alarmed barking we'd heard earlier. But now it seemed like they were responding to whatever was tracking us through the woods. About half a mile from the exit near my house, we had to slow down. We were all exhausted, stumbling more than running at that point. The sounds behind us had become more aggressive. Branches breaking, heavy footfalls in the snow, and occasional thumps as more objects were thrown in our direction, landing in the snow around us. I remember looking back and seeing something move between the trees about 20 feet off the trail. It was dark and fast, just a shadow, really, but big enough to push through the underbrush with force. I couldn't make out what it was, but I knew with absolute certainty it wasn't a person. When we finally burst out of the woods behind my house, it was around 3:30 a.m. We didn't stop there. I was terrified that whatever had followed us would come out into the open. We ran all the way around to the front of my neighborhood and walked the streets for another hour before I felt safe enough to go home. The whole time we were walking those streets, we kept asking each other what we thought it was. Tyler was convinced it was someone playing a prank, but I kept coming back to one simple fact. The snow was deep, untouched in most places off-trail. Anyone trying to follow and harass us would have left obvious tracks and would have struggled to move quickly enough to keep pace. But whatever followed us moved effortlessly through that winter forest. Chris thought maybe it was a moose or bear, but the behavior was all wrong. Animals don't stalk groups of humans for miles, throwing objects and testing boundaries. Besides, most bears are hibernating in January in Vermont. I still live in the same house. I still see those woods every day from my window, but I haven't gone back on that trail since that night, not even in daylight. Sometimes, especially on clear winter nights when the moon is full, I swear I can see movement among the trees at the edge of the woods. And on the coldest, quietest nights, I've heard branches breaking out there, like something pacing at the forest's edge. I don't know what followed us through those woods last winter. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my mind, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but nothing makes sense. Maybe that's what scares me the most. Not knowing what it was, but knowing with absolute certainty that it was real, it was intelligent, and for reasons I'll never understand, it chose us that night. Story 13. I've been debating whether to share this for over 25 years now. I'm not the type who goes around telling ghost stories or claiming I've seen UFOs. Anyone who knows me will tell you I'm about as practical and level-headed as they come. I'm 67 years old now, spent most of my life working as a wildlife biologist before retiring, and have been hunting since I was 12. I've tracked and hunted everything from whitetail in Pennsylvania to mule deer in Colorado, elk in Montana, and even brown bears here in Alaska, where I've lived for the last 30 years. What I'm about to share happened in October 1998, and to this day I can't explain it. My hunting partner Jim and I had been planning our caribou hunt for months. Jim's been my hunting buddy for over 20 years, former Marine, expert marksman, and has probably spent more time in the Alaskan backcountry than most park rangers. Between the two of us, we've logged thousands of hours in the wilderness and have seen pretty much everything Alaska has to offer, or so I thought. We chartered a bush plane to drop us about 70 miles southwest of Iliamna, deep in the Alaska peninsula. The pilot, Pete, was a local guy who'd been flying these routes for decades. The plan was for a 5-day hunt, with Pete returning to pick us up at a predetermined landing spot near a small lake. The weather on day 1 was typical Alaska fall, crisp around 40 degrees, with patchy fog that cleared up by mid-morning. We spent that first day setting up our base camp and scouting the immediate area, nothing unusual. Day 2, October 16th, 1998. That's the day I still can't get out of my head. We left camp before sunrise, hiking about 3 miles to a ridge that overlooked a massive clearing, probably close to half a mile wide with scattered patches of brush, surrounded by dense spruce forest. It was the perfect spot to glass for caribou. The clearing was about 1,000 yards from our position, giving us a perfect vantage point to scan the entire area. We settled in around 7:30 a.m. as the first real light was breaking. For the first hour or so, we saw nothing but a few ravens and a red fox crossing the far end of the clearing. The morning was dead quiet, except for the occasional gust of wind. Jim and I weren't talking much. When you've hunted with someone for 2 decades, you don't need to fill the silence. Around 9 a.m., I was scanning the eastern edge of the clearing with my Swarovski binoculars, 10A42, crystal clear glass that I'd invested in a few years prior. I remember adjusting the focus slightly when I noticed movement between 2 large spruce trees at the clearing's edge. At first I thought it might be a bear. We see plenty of them up here, and a black bear standing on its hind legs can look surprisingly human-like from a distance. But within seconds, I knew this wasn't a bear. "Jim," I said, keeping my voice low even though we were too far away to spook anything. "Take a look at the eastern edge, between those 2 big spruce trees." Jim raised his own binoculars. A few seconds of silence passed. "What the hell is that?" he finally whispered. The figure was tall. I'd estimate at least 7 feet, maybe more. It was covered in what appeared to be dark grey or brownish-grey hair, longer on the shoulders and back. But what struck me immediately was how it moved. It was walking completely upright, on two legs, with a stride that was unmistakably deliberate and purposeful. Not a bear, not an elk, nothing I'd ever seen in all my years in the wilderness. My first thought was that it might be another hunter, maybe wearing some kind of ghillie suit, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms hung lower than a human's would, and the head sat directly on the shoulders with almost no visible neck. And the way it moved, no human moves like that. We watched, completely frozen, as this thing walked from one large spruce to another on the opposite side of the clearing, a distance of maybe 500 yards. Its gait was smooth but slightly swinging, almost like a pendulum motion with each step. Then it turned and walked back. This continued for what must have been at least 30 minutes. "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Jim asked, his voice unusually tight. I couldn't even respond at first. My mouth had gone completely dry, and my hands were starting to shake slightly, making it hard to keep the binoculars steady. I've faced down charging brown bears and haven't felt that kind of primal fear. "It's watching for something," I finally said. The behavior was unmistakable. This thing was patrolling, watching, waiting. At one point it stopped in the middle of the clearing and seemed to look directly in our direction. I felt my heart skip a beat. There's no way it could see us from that distance. We were well concealed and downwind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it somehow knew we were there. Jim and I stayed absolutely motionless. Neither of us reached for our rifles. Neither of us spoke about doing so. Something about this situation felt completely outside the realm of hunting. This wasn't prey. This wasn't even wildlife as we understood it. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, the figure resumed its back-and-forth pattern. The whole time I was mentally cataloguing every detail, trying to make it fit with something, anything I knew. Was it some kind of undocumented primate? A person in a suit? But we were 70-plus miles from the nearest settlement, in terrain that would be nearly impossible to traverse without proper gear and experience. Then, around 9:45 a.m., we noticed movement at the western end of the clearing. A small herd of caribou, maybe 12-15 animals, began to enter the open space. They were moving cautiously, as caribou do, stopping frequently to raise their heads and test the air. The reaction from the bipedal creature was immediate. It stopped its pacing, stood completely still for several seconds, then moved with surprising speed toward the tree line. Its movement wasn't frantic or startled. It was deliberate, almost like it didn't want to be seen by the caribou. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the thick brush and spruce at the edge of the clearing. The caribou continued into the clearing, unaware or unconcerned. They began grazing normally, which told me they hadn't sensed the creature that had just been there. This struck me as odd. Caribou have excellent senses and would typically react to a predator's presence. Jim and I remained in position, barely breathing, scanning the tree line for any sign of the creature. But it was gone. The dense Alaskan undergrowth had swallowed it completely. "What do we do?" Jim finally asked after several minutes had passed. It was a good question. We'd come all this way for caribou, and here was a perfect herd right in front of us. Under normal circumstances, we'd be setting up for a shot, but neither of us made a move toward our rifles. "I don't know about you," I said, "but I don't feel right about shooting anything right now." Jim nodded slowly. "Yeah, me neither." We stayed on that ridge for another hour, but the creature never reappeared. The caribou eventually moved on, drifting back into the forest on the western edge of the clearing. We finally decided to head back to camp. The whole hike back, we kept scanning our surroundings, suddenly aware of every shadow, every movement in the trees. We'd both spent countless nights in the backcountry, but this was different. For the first time in my outdoor life, I felt like we were being watched, not by a curious bear or a cautious moose, but by something that understood exactly what we were and what we were doing there. Back at camp, we finally talked about what we'd seen. Jim, like me, had spent his life in the outdoors and knew every animal in North America by sight. He'd been a hunting guide in Montana before moving to Alaska. If anyone could identify strange wildlife, it was him. "It wasn't a bear," he said flatly, stoking our small camp stove. "Bears don't move like that even when they're on their hind legs, and it wasn't a person." "So what was it?" I asked, though I already knew where the conversation was headed. Jim was quiet for a long moment. "I never believed those stories," he finally said. "All those years guiding in Montana, I'd hear clients talk about Bigfoot sightings. Always thought it was bullshit." I nodded. I'd felt the same way. The whole concept of an undiscovered man-like creature living in North American forests had always seemed ridiculous to me. The continent had been too thoroughly explored, too extensively hunted and logged and developed for something that large to remain unverified. Yet we'd both just seen something that defied explanation. We decided to continue our hunt, but agreed to stay away from that particular clearing. Over the next 3 days, we managed to take 2 caribou from a different area, about 4 miles from our camp. Neither of us mentioned the creature again while we were out there. It was almost like we'd made an unspoken agreement to process it later. On our final day, Pete, the pilot, returned to pick us up as planned. As we loaded our gear and the caribou meat, I found myself scanning the distant tree line one last time. "Good hunt?" Pete asked as we secured everything in the plane. "Got what we came for," Jim replied, gesturing to the meat. I hesitated, then decided to say something. "Pete, this might sound strange, but we saw something unusual out there. Big, grey, walking on 2 legs between the trees. Not a bear, not a moose, not like anything I've seen before." Pete's reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of surprise or skepticism, he just nodded matter-of-factly. "Where'd you see it?" I described the clearing and its approximate location. Pete nodded again. "Yep, that tracks. The local Dena'ina people call it Hairy Man. Been stories about them in this area for generations. Hunters see them every few years, usually just glimpses." Jim and I exchanged looks. "You're saying this is known?" I asked. "Oh, sure," Pete said, securing the last of our gear. "Most folks who've spent enough time out here have stories. Just not something people talk about much. You mentioned seeing something like that to the wrong person. They start thinking you've been alone in the bush too long." The flight back was mostly silent. I kept replaying the sighting in my mind, trying to reconcile it with my understanding of the natural world. I'd spent my entire adult life studying and observing North American wildlife. I'd written papers on caribou migration patterns. I'd tracked wolf packs in winter. I knew what was supposed to be out there. This thing wasn't supposed to be out there. In the 25 years since, I've told this story exactly 3 times. Once to my wife, who listened patiently, but clearly didn't know what to make of it. Once to a close friend, who's also a biologist, who suggested it might have been a case of mistaken identity combined with the strange light you get in Alaska. And once, about 10 years ago, to a small group of researchers who specifically study these kinds of encounters. Those researchers were the only ones who didn't question what I saw. They showed me reports from other hunters, recordings of stories from indigenous people throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, detailed sketches based on other sightings that matched what Jim and I had observed almost exactly. I still hunt. I still spend weeks each year in the Alaskan backcountry, but I've never seen anything like that creature again. Sometimes, especially when I'm alone in the forest at dusk, I catch myself scanning the spaces between the trees, looking for that distinctive silhouette. Jim passed away 3 years ago from cancer. Before he died, we talked about that day one last time. "You know what still gets me?" he said, his voice weak, but his eyes still sharp. "The way it moved when the caribou showed up. That wasn't an animal reacting on instinct. That thing made a decision. It didn't want to be seen." I still don't know what we saw that October morning in 1998. I don't have a fancy name for it or a theory that makes everything make sense. All I know is that somewhere in the vast Alaskan wilderness, there's something moving between the trees that science says shouldn't exist. And sometimes, if you're in the right place at the right time, it lets itself be seen. Story 14. I've been sitting on this experience for over 20 years now. It happened back in June 2000, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I've told a few people over the years, but the reactions are always the same. Raised eyebrows, awkward laughs, or uncomfortable silence followed by a topic change. So I've mostly kept it to myself, but I need to get this out somewhere people might actually listen. My buddy Chris and I had been planning this Alaska trip for months. We were both into hiking and camping, but neither of us had ever been that far north. The Kenai area was supposed to have these amazing views of glaciers that were apparently worth the trouble of getting there. We'd flown into Anchorage, rented a Jeep, and spent most of the day driving to reach our destination. Looking back, our first mistake was leaving too late. We'd gotten sidetracked at this little diner along the way, then took a wrong turn that cost us almost an hour. By the time we finally reached the trailhead parking lot, the sun was already starting to set. In Alaska in June, that doesn't mean it gets completely dark, more like a weird extended twilight. But it was definitely too late to hike all the way to our planned camping spot near the glacier. We should just find somewhere to crash for the night and start fresh tomorrow, Chris said, adjusting his backpack. I don't want to be setting up camp in the dark. I agreed, and we headed down the main trail with our headlamps ready, looking for the first decent spot to pitch our tent. About half a mile in, we found a small clearing maybe 30 yards off the main trail. It wasn't ideal, a bit closer to the trail than I would have liked, but we were tired and the temperature was dropping faster than I expected. "This'll work," I said, already unstrapping my tent from my pack. "We can get an early start tomorrow." The clearing was surrounded by these massive pine trees, and the ground was covered in pine needles, which actually made for decent cushioning. We worked quickly, setting up our two-person tent and hanging our food supplies from a tree branch about 15 feet off the ground. Bears were a legitimate concern in that area, and we'd been warned repeatedly about proper food storage. After a quick meal of granola bars and beef jerky, we were too tired to fire up the portable stove. Chris crawled into the tent while I decided to have a cigarette. I was a smoker back then, quit 10 years ago, but at the time I needed that nightcap smoke to wind down. "I'm going to step out to the trail for a smoke," I called to Chris, who grunted something inaudible from inside the tent. He was probably already half asleep. I grabbed my lighter and cigarettes and walked back to the main trail. It was probably around 10:30 p.m. by then, but there was still this weird grayish light. Not quite daylight, not quite dark. Alaska summers are strange that way. The air had gotten really cold, probably in the low 40s, and there was this stillness that's hard to describe. No wind, no animal sounds, just complete silence. I stood on the edge of the trail, lit my cigarette, and just enjoyed the quiet for a minute. That's when I first noticed it. About 50 yards down the trail, in the direction we'd come from, I saw what looked like someone on a bicycle. At least that's what my brain first registered. A dark figure hunched over what appeared to be handlebars. I remember thinking it was strange that someone would be biking the trail at this hour, especially since we hadn't seen another soul since leaving the parking lot. "Hey, Chris," I called back toward our campsite. "There's someone coming up the trail." I squinted, trying to get a better look as the figure remained in place. That's when I realized something wasn't right. The bicycle wasn't moving forward at all. It was just there, static. And as my eyes adjusted better to the distance and the dim light, I realized what I was seeing wasn't making sense. The figure was completely black. Not like African-American black, but pitch black, like a silhouette cut out of the world. And it was huge. My mind had interpreted the posture as someone on a bike, but there was no bike. The legs were spread unnaturally far apart, and the arms were curved at the sides, like they were gripping invisible handlebars. But the proportions were all wrong, way too big to be a person. My first thought was bear, but I'd seen plenty of bears on nature shows, and this wasn't how they stood. Bears don't stand with their legs spread wide like that, and this thing was on two legs, completely upright. I heard Chris shuffling out of the tent behind me. "What is it?" he called. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. "I don't know," I said. "I thought it was someone on a bike, but—" My voice trailed off as I tried to process what I was seeing. The cigarette burned forgotten between my fingers. "But what?" Chris was walking up behind me now. As he approached, I pointed, turning my head briefly toward him to make sure he was looking in the right direction. "That thing. Down the trail. Do you see it?" When I turned back, everything changed. The figure was moving now, but not how anything human moves. It didn't turn around. It didn't walk away. It just shot sideways into the forest with this fluid, impossibly fast movement that didn't seem to involve joints or muscles the way normal locomotion does. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, disappearing into the trees with a speed that made me gasp. "What the hell was that?" I said, more to myself than to Chris. Chris was standing beside me now, peering down the trail. "I don't see anything, man. It just went into the woods. It was right there." I pointed again, my hand shaking, like a big black figure standing weird with its arms out, and then it just moved. So fast. Chris looked at me sideways. "You sure it wasn't a moose or something? They can be pretty big." "It wasn't a moose." My voice came out sharper than I intended. "It was standing on two legs, and when it moved—" "Chris, nothing moves like that. Nothing natural anyway." I could tell he didn't believe me. Hell, I was standing right there, and I barely believed what I'd seen myself. "Let's go back to the tent," Chris said finally. "It's getting cold, and we've got an early start tomorrow." I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves, wondering if that thing was out there, watching our tent. Chris fell asleep almost immediately, his steady breathing only making me more aware of how alone I was with my thoughts. The worst part was trying to rationalize what I'd seen. My brain kept trying to fit it into categories: bear, moose, person, but none of them worked. The size, the posture, the movement, it was all wrong. And the way it had darted into the forest wasn't like anything I'd ever seen an animal do. It moved with purpose, with intelligence, but also with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for its size. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, but also determined to find some evidence. After a quick breakfast that I barely tasted, I convinced Chris to check out the spot where I'd seen the figure. "I just want to see if there are any tracks or something," I told him, "just to know what it was." He agreed, probably to humor me, and we walked down the trail to the approximate location. I stepped off the path to where I thought the thing had entered the forest and started looking for signs. Broken branches, footprints, anything. There was nothing. No tracks in the soft ground, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that anything had passed that way. I expanded my search, moving deeper into the trees, but found absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. "Maybe it was further down," I said, not ready to give up. Chris sighed. "Marcus, look, I'm not saying you didn't see something, but we've got a full day of hiking ahead of us if we want to reach that glacier. We should get moving." I knew he was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. Reluctantly, I rejoined him on the trail, and we continued our hike. The rest of the trip was objectively beautiful. The glacier was everything the guidebooks promised, but I couldn't fully enjoy it. Every time we were on the trail, especially as evening approached, I found myself scanning the trees, looking for that black figure. We never saw it again, and eventually the trip ended. We flew back home, returned to our jobs, and life went on. but I never forgot what I saw that night. Over the years, I've tried researching what it could have been. I've looked into known wildlife in the area, local legends, everything I could think of. The closest thing I found was some obscure native Alaskan folklore about forest spirits that could mimic human shapes, but even that didn't quite match what I'd seen. I've told the story a few times, usually after a few beers when someone's sharing ghost stories or weird experiences, but I always leave out certain details or downplay how strange it really was, because the full truth sounds crazy, even to me sometimes. But I know what I saw. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal, at least not any known species. The black color wasn't fur or clothing. It was more like an absence of light, if that makes any sense. And the way it moved defied physics as I understand them. Sometimes I wonder if I should go back, maybe with better equipment, cameras, or other people who might be more open to the possibility of something unexplainable. But another part of me is afraid, not just of seeing that thing again, but of not seeing it, of spending days searching and finding nothing, which would only reinforce what everyone already thinks. That I imagined it all. But I didn't imagine it. I was stone-cold sober, fully alert, and I saw what I saw. Something was on that trail that night. Something that shouldn't exist according to what we know about the natural world. And sometimes, especially on quiet nights when I'm alone, I wonder if it's still out there in those Alaskan woods, standing with its legs spread wide and its arms curved at its sides, waiting for another hiker to spot it before it darts away into the darkness. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Most people don't, but I know what I saw, and 20 years later, I'm still trying to make sense of it. That black figure on the Kennecott Trail changed how I see the world, how I understand reality, because if that thing exists, whatever it was, then what else might be out there that we don't know about? What else might be watching us from the shadows when we think we're alone? I've never found an answer. Maybe I never will. But I know what I saw that night in Alaska, and no amount of skepticism or rational explanation will ever convince me otherwise. Story 15. I still get chills thinking about what happened that summer night in 2003. It's been almost 20 years, but I remember it like it was yesterday. We lived in a rural area of Lincoln County, Tennessee, about 15 miles southeast of Fayetteville at the time. Our property backed up to thick woods with fields on either side. Normal country living, you know. Nothing special or different from any other rural home in the South. That evening started like any other summer night. The air was thick with humidity, and you could hear all those summer insects making their usual racket. We'd had dinner, and everyone was just relaxing in the living room, watching TV. My sister and her boyfriend Michael were visiting for the weekend, and my niece was staying with us for a couple weeks while her parents were away on some work trip. It was getting dark, and my niece Jessica suddenly remembered she'd left the windows down in her car. It had been threatening to rain all day, so she jumped up and said she'd go roll them up real quick. She was 17 at the time, a responsible kid who'd been driving for about a year. I didn't think anything of it when she went outside. I remember checking the clock. It was just after 9:30 p.m. The sun had fully set, but there was still that faint blue light hanging in the sky. You know that time of evening in summer when it's not fully dark yet? That's when everything started. Jessica was only outside for maybe 2 minutes when we heard the front door fly open and slam against the wall. She came running in, white as a sheet, breathing hard like she'd just sprinted a mile. At first, I thought maybe she'd seen a snake or something. They're common around here, and she's always been terrified of them. Aunt Sarah, she was practically hyperventilating. There's something out there, in the field, something white. It's making noises. My husband Tom looked up from the TV, annoyed at first. Probably just old man Jenkins' goat got loose again, he said, not even bothering to get up. But Jessica was shaking her head frantically. No, it's not a goat. It's standing up, like a person, but it's not a person, and it's making these These calling sounds, that's when our dogs started going crazy outside. We have two lab mixes and a blue heeler, and they're usually pretty quiet unless something's really wrong. But now they were barking like they were possessed, that deep threatening bark dogs make when they sense danger. Michael, my daughter Amy's boyfriend, was the first one to actually take Jessica seriously. He's an outdoorsy type, hunts, fishes, knows the woods around here better than most locals, even though he's not from here originally. He got up and went to the window, pulling the curtain aside to look out. "I don't see anything from here," he said, but the way he said it made my skin crawl, like he believed something was out there, even if he couldn't see it. "Where exactly did you see it, Jess?" he asked, grabbing the big mag light we keep by the door. Jessica pointed toward the east side of our property, where our fence line meets the edge of the woods. Over there, by the big oak tree, it was just standing there, watching me. By now, Amy had her arm around Jessica, who was still trembling. Tom had muted the TV but was still sitting, looking skeptical. I remember feeling caught between believing Jessica and thinking she was just letting her imagination run wild in the dark. Michael grabbed his boots. "I'm going to go check it out." "I'll come with you," Tom finally said, getting up, but Michael shook his head. "Let me take a quick look first. If it's nothing, no point in everyone traipsing around in the dark." He flipped on the porch light and stepped outside, the flashlight beam sweeping across the yard. From the window, I watched him walk toward where Jessica had pointed, the dogs following him, still barking, but staying close to him rather than running ahead like they normally would. That should have been my first clue. Something was really wrong. Our dogs are brave to the point of stupidity usually. Michael made it about halfway to the fence line when he suddenly stopped. The light from his flashlight was fixed on something I couldn't see from the house. He stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 seconds. Then he turned and walked quickly, not running but moving with purpose, back to the house. When he came inside, his face had the same pale look Jessica's had. "There's definitely something moving around out there," he said quietly. "I'm going to get my gun from the truck." Now, we're not the type to grab guns at every little thing. We own them, sure. Most folks around here do, but they stay locked up unless we're hunting or at the range. So when Michael said he was getting his gun, that's when I started to really worry. He went out to his truck and came back with his .30-06 hunting rifle. By this point, Tom was fully invested too, grabbing his shotgun from the gun safe. "What exactly did you see?" Tom asked Michael. "Movement. Something big moving along the tree line. Couldn't make it out clearly." He checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. "I'm going to go back out and get a better look." "I'm coming with you," Tom insisted. Michael nodded. "Stay on the porch with the light behind us," he told Amy, Jessica, and me. "If we need to come back in a hurry, we need to see where we're going." I remember feeling a knot forming in my stomach as they headed back outside. Amy and Jessica and I stood on the porch, the yellow porch light creating a small circle of visibility in the darkness. The dogs had gone quiet, which was somehow worse than the barking. They were huddled near the steps, whining softly. Michael and Tom moved slowly toward the fence line, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. They got to about where Michael had stopped before, then continued on toward the fence. Nothing happened for a minute or two. They were talking to each other, but we couldn't hear what they were saying from the porch. Then Michael's flashlight beam stopped moving, fixed on a spot in the woods just beyond our property. Tom's light swung to the same place a second later. What happened next is something I'll never forget as long as I live. Michael raised his rifle to his shoulder, aiming into the darkness beyond the reach of their flashlights. There was a moment of complete silence. Even the insects seemed to stop. And then the crack of the rifle shot split the night. The sound echoed across the field and woods around us. "Oh my God!" Amy gasped beside me, grabbing my arm. What we saw next, I still have trouble putting it into words. From where their flashlights were pointing, something moved, something massive, something white. It rose up from the ground or stepped out from behind a tree. I couldn't tell exactly, but it was huge. Taller than a man, much broader across the shoulders than any person I've ever seen. The flashlight beams were right on it now, and I could see it clearly despite the distance. It was covered in shaggy white hair, long and coarse-looking, like a golden retriever but with that yellowed white color you see in elderly people's hair. It stood on two legs, completely upright like a human, but its face, God, its face. It wasn't human, but it wasn't fully animal either. There was something monkey-like about the features, but more, I don't know, intelligent, aware. The eyes caught the flashlight and reflected it back, glowing in that way animal eyes do in the dark. Michael fired again, and the creature kind of stumbled or lurched to one side. I thought for a second it was going to fall, but then it turned and moved into the trees. It didn't drop to all fours like a bear or other animal would. It ran on two legs, disappearing into the woods with a speed that didn't seem possible for something so large. Tom and Michael were yelling now, backing up toward the house, never taking their eyes or flashlight beams off the spot where the creature had vanished into the tree line. "Get inside! Get inside now!" Tom was shouting as they reached the porch. We all scrambled back into the house, the men coming in last and locking the door behind them. What the hell was that? Amy was nearly hysterical, and Jessica was openly crying now. Michael's hands were shaking as he put his rifle down on the table. I don't know what the fuck that was." Tom went around checking all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. "Did you hit it?" he asked Michael. "I think so. First shot might have missed, but the second one, it reacted like I hit it. Didn't drop it, though." We all sat in the living room, lights on, weapons within reach, for the rest of the night. Nobody slept. Nobody even tried to. We kept taking turns, looking out the windows, but we never saw the creature again that night. The next morning, when it was fully light, Tom and Michael went out to check where they'd seen the creature. They found some broken branches and what might have been large footprints in a muddy patch near the fence, but the ground was too dry overall to show clear tracks. They looked for blood, but didn't find any. If Michael had hit it, it hadn't bled much. For weeks afterward, we were on edge. We installed more security lights around the property. The dogs wouldn't go near that part of the fence line for months. Jessica refused to go outside alone after dark for the rest of her stay with us. We reported what we saw to the local sheriff, but they just wrote it down as a possible bear sighting. But I know what bears look like. We all do. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand upright and run on two legs like that. They don't have that kind of face. And I've never heard of a white bear in Tennessee. Over the years, I've done some research, trying to make sense of what we saw that night. I've read about albino Sasquatch sightings in the southeastern United States. The descriptions match what we saw. The white hair, the size, the way it moved. But I've never been the type to believe in Bigfoot or monsters in the woods. Yet I know what I saw. Amy knows what she saw. Jessica and Michael too. We all saw the same thing, and none of us has ever been able to explain it. We still live in the same house. Life went on. But things changed after that night. We don't use that side of the property much anymore. I don't let my grandkids play near that fence line. And none of us likes to talk about it, even with each other. Sometimes at night, especially in summer when the windows are open, I'll wake up thinking I hear something. That same strange calling sound Jessica described. It's probably just a dream or my mind playing tricks. But I always check to make sure the doors are locked, just in case. Whatever was out there that night, I hope to God I never see it again. And I hope to God it stays in those woods where it belongs.